On a dry hilltop in the south of what is now Turkey, there stands a ring of great stone pillars that should not exist. They are carved with foxes and scorpions and vultures, with the delicacy of a practiced hand. They weigh as much as 10 or 15 tons apiece. They were raised and shaped and set in careful circles by people who had no metal tools, no writing, no wheel, no pottery, no farms, and no cities. People who, by every rule we thought we understood, should not have been capable of building anything at all. And then, most strangely of all, after standing for centuries, the whole vast sanctuary was deliberately buried, filled in by hand, hidden under the earth of the hill, where it waited in the dark for 11,500 years until a curious archaeologist, in the closing years of the 20th century, dug a test trench into a mound everyone had assumed was medieval and found the oldest temple in the world. Hello, traveller. Tonight, we set out on the entire story of the first civilizations, the long, astonishing, and still half-mysterious tale of how humanity, after 200,000 years of wandering the earth and building nothing that lasted, suddenly, in the space of a few thousand years, learned to raise temples and dig cities and write down its own name. Before we begin, take a moment, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel, but only if these journeys are truly yours. And leave a word below to say where you're listening from tonight, and the hour it is where you are. There's a quiet pleasure in seeing who else has gathered here tonight, in how many countries, under how many skies. Now, let the lights go low, let the world go quiet, and let's step into the story together. The stone circles on that Turkish hill are called Göbekli Tepe, and to understand why they matter, why they overturned everything, you have to understand the order in which things were supposed to happen. The story we told ourselves for a century went like this. First, human beings learned to farm. Farming produced surplus food. Surplus food freed some people from the fields and let them settle in one place and grow numerous and specialize into potters and priests and kings. Settled, fed, and organized, they built villages, then towns, then cities. And only then, once they had cities and surplus and priests and power, only then did they raise great monuments to their gods. Farming first, then villages, then, at the very end, temples. That was the sequence. That was the ladder every civilization was supposed to climb, one rung at a time, in the same order, everywhere. Göbekli Tepe breaks the ladder, because Göbekli Tepe is a temple, an enormous, sophisticated, coordinated religious monument built by people at the very bottom of the ladder. It was raised around 9,600 BC, more than 11,000 years ago. That is roughly 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It is older than writing, older than the wheel, older than metal, older than the humble clay pot. And crucially, it appears to be older than farming itself. Built not by settled farmers with surplus grain, but by hunter-gatherers, by roving bands of people who still lived off the wild, who followed the herds and gathered the wild seeds, and who had, as far as we can tell, no cities and no kings and no agriculture to make such a thing possible. And yet somehow they came together, in numbers, and quarried these massive stones, and carved them with animals, and raised them into rings, and did this not once but over and over across centuries, and then buried it all. The mystery this opens is not a small one. It is, quite possibly, the deepest question in the whole human story. How did civilization begin? What was the spark? For 200,000 years, 10,000 human generations, anatomically modern people, people exactly like us, with brains exactly like ours, lived on this planet and built nothing permanent. They made tools and art and buried their dead, and they were fully, achingly human. But they did not settle, did not farm, did not write, did not raise cities. And then, in a geological instant, a span of a few thousand years, the blink of an eye against that vast backdrop, everything changed. All at once, in several different places, on different continents, peoples who could not possibly have known of one another began to do the same astonishing things. To plant seeds, to herd animals, to build permanent houses, to gather in the thousands, to invent writing, to raise monuments to the sky. Civilization did not creep in slowly and steadily over the whole long human story. It erupted, late and fast, in a handful of separate cradles, as if some threshold had been crossed, some door thrown open, all at once, across the world. Tonight we are going to walk through those cradles, one by one, and stand in the first cities humanity ever built. We will begin here, on the Anatolian hills, with Göbekli Tepe and the strange painted town of Çatalhöyük, where the very first stones were set and the very first streets were laid. We will travel down into the land between two rivers, into Sumer, where the first true cities rose from the mud, and where a scribe, pressing marks into wet clay to count sacks of grain, accidentally invented writing and gave humanity its memory. We will follow the Nile into Egypt, where a different river bred a different immortality. We will go east to the banks of the Indus, to the vast, orderly, forgotten cities of a civilization so completely lost that we still cannot read its writing or even say for certain what it called itself. We will go further east still, to the Yellow River of China, where civilization was born a second time, entirely on its own. And we will cross an entire ocean to the coast of Peru, to Corral, where people who had never heard of Egypt or Sumer, who were separated from them by half the globe and by thousands of years of isolation, raised pyramids of their own beside the Pacific, proving that the impulse to build, to gather, to reach for the sky was not the invention of any one people, but something that rises, again and again, out of the deep bedrock of what it means to be human. And running underneath all of it, from the first buried pillar of Göbekli Tepe to the last, will be the great question, the hole at the center of the whole story, the thing we still cannot fully answer. Why? Why then, after so long? Why there, in those particular valleys? And why, when it finally came, did it come in the same shapes? The city, the temple, the king, the written word, in places that could not have shared the secret? These are the questions that hang over the first cities of the world like the smoke of their first hearths. We may not answer them all tonight. The honest truth is that no one fully can. But we are going to stand in the places where it happened and look at what these first people left behind, and let the deep, strange, patient mystery of humanity's beginning settle over us like the dust settling over a buried temple in the oldest silence there is. Before we go down into the cradles, we have to sit for a moment with the strangeness of the thing itself, because it is easy to say the words, the birth of civilization, and let them slide past without feeling how genuinely bizarre the event was. So let us feel it. Anatomically modern humans. People with our bodies, our hands, our brains, people who, if you dressed them in modern clothes and set them on a train, you would not look at twice, have existed for something like 200,000 years, and by some measures, 300,000. That is an almost unimaginable stretch of time. If you compressed the whole history of our species into a single 24-hour day, then everything we are going to talk about tonight, every city, every pyramid, every line of writing, the Sumerians and the Egyptians and the whole of what we call history, all of it happens in the last few minutes before midnight. For 23 hours and 50-something minutes, human beings exactly like us lived on this earth and did not build a single city. They were not stupid. They were not waiting. Their brains were not smaller or slower than ours. They painted the caves of Lascaux and Chauvet with an artistry that still stops us cold. They carved figurines. They made music. They buried their dead with flowers and ornament. They crossed oceans to settle Australia. They survived ice ages. They were us in every way that matters. And for 200,000 years, they built nothing that outlasted a generation, planted nothing, wrote nothing, ruled no one. And then it changed. Not gradually, not everywhere at once in a slow global dawn, but late and fast and in scattered bursts, beginning around 12,000 years ago. And it is worth holding on to that number, 12,000 years, because against 200,000 it is nothing. It is the last 0.5% of our story. Human beings in a handful of separate places began, independently, to do a set of things they had never done before. They began to tend, and then to plant the wild grasses whose seeds they had once merely gathered. They began to pen, and then to breed the wild animals they had once merely hunted. They began to build houses meant to stand for generations, and to bury their dead beneath the floors, and to stay. And from that staying, everything else came. The village, the surplus, the crowd, the temple, the specialist, the ruler, the tax, the written record, the city, the empire, the whole world we live in, the world of walls and words and clocks and kings, grew out of that one strange late turning when a species that had wandered for 200,000 years decided, in several places at once, to stop. Why? That is the hole at the center of this story, and honesty requires admitting at the outset that we do not have a complete answer. We have pieces. We know that the last ice age ended right around then, that the climate warmed and steadied, that the wild grains spread across the hills of the Near East in stands so thick a family could harvest enough in a few weeks to live on. We know that populations had been slowly growing, that people in some places had already begun to settle near, especially rich wild resources before they farmed at all. We have theories about climate, about population pressure, about social competition, about religion, and we will weigh them, honestly, later tonight. But the truth that serious scholars will tell you is that the transition remains, at its deepest level, not fully explained. We can describe what happened with great precision. We can date it, map it, dig it up, and hold it in our hands. But the why? The reason a threshold that had held for 200,000 years suddenly gave way, in multiple places, within a few thousand years of one another. That remains one of the great open questions of human science. This is the detective's problem, and it is the frame through which we will look at everything tonight. We are not going to pretend to a certainty we do not have. When we know something, we will say we know it. When we are guessing, we will say we are guessing. And when we reach the edge of what anyone can say, when we stand at the buried pillars of Göbekli Tepe and ask what they were for, or look at the silent script of the Indus and ask what it says, we will let the question stand open, unanswered, rather than fill it with a comfortable lie. Because the mystery is not a flaw in the story. The mystery is the story. The birth of civilization is the single most consequential thing our species has ever done, and we are still, even now, working out how and why we did it. There is something wonderful in that, in standing at the very beginning of everything, torch in hand, and finding that the beginning still keeps some of its secrets. And it is worth remembering how new all of this knowledge is, how recently the picture came into focus, because it reminds us that the story of the first cities is still being written, still being overturned, even now. Göbekli Tepe was only recognized for what it is in the 1990s. Before that, the whole radical possibility it opened, that monumental religion might have come before farming, was not even on the table. The Indus civilization was entirely unknown, forgotten by all the world, until the 1920s. For all of previous history, no one knew that one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world had ever existed. Carroll's true antiquity was only established around the turn of the 21st century, pushing the birth of civilization in the Americas back by more than 1,000 years in a single stroke. Even the decipherment of cuneiform and hieroglyphs, the very ability to read the words of the first civilizations at all, is less than 2 centuries old. For thousands of years, the writing of Sumer and Egypt was silent stone, unreadable, and everything those peoples had written of themselves was lost to human understanding until scholars, quite recently, cracked the codes and let the ancient voices speak again. We are, in other words, the first generation of human beings ever to be able to see the whole shape of this story, to read the first writings, to know of the forgotten giants, to hold the true dates in our hands. And even now, the picture keeps shifting with every excavation, every new technique, every buried tablet or unearthed wall. The beginning of the world is not a settled and finished tale we have safely in hand. It is a living mystery, still yielding its secrets, still capable of astonishing us, and we are lucky enough to live at the first moment when its true dimensions have begun, at last, to come clear. To understand the first cities, you have to first understand the world they interrupted. The long, deep, human world that came before, the world of the wanderers. Because the people who built the first villages were not blank slates or brutes stumbling out of the dark. They were the inheritors of that immense 200,000-year story, and they carried all of its accumulated skill and knowledge with them when they finally settled. The city did not rise out of ignorance. It rose out of a way of life that was, in its own terms, a triumph. For the overwhelming majority of human existence, people lived as hunter-gatherers, in small bands, usually of a few dozen souls, moving with the seasons across a landscape they knew with an intimacy no modern person could match. They did not own much, because ownership is a burden when you carry everything on your back. They did not store much, because they lived from the land's rolling abundance rather than against its scarcity. A band might follow the migrating herds in one season, camp beside the salmon runs in another, move to the high ground when the berries ripened, come down to the sheltered valleys when the cold came. They read the world like a book written in tracks and weather and the turning of the stars. Where the game would be, when the wild wheat would ripen, which plants would heal and which would kill, how to find water in a dry land and shelter in a storm. Their heads held libraries. A single experienced forager knew the names and uses and seasons of hundreds of plants, the behavior of dozens of animals, the map of a territory that might stretch for hundreds of miles, and the long oral memory of their people stretching back generations. This was not a poor or brutish life. By many measures, leisure, diet, equality, physical health. It compared, well, sometimes very well, with the life of the farmers who came after. And it was, above all, a life of movement and of relative equality. In a small band that must carry its possessions and share its food to survive, great inequalities are hard to build and harder to keep. There were leaders, certainly, the wise, the skilled, the persuasive. But there were no kings, because there was nothing for a king to control. There were no rich and poor in the way we mean it, because there was no surplus to hoard, no fields to own, no granaries to guard. The forager's wealth was knowledge and kin and freedom of movement, and these could not easily be taken or monopolized. For 200,000 years, this was the human condition. Mobile, skilled, egalitarian, close to the land, and bound together in small groups by ties of blood and friendship and shared memory. When we talk about what civilization gained, we must not forget what this world had, because much of what civilization cost was measured against it. As the last ice age loosened its grip, around 14 or 15,000 years ago, this ancient world began, in certain favored places, to shift. The warming climate expanded the range of the wild grains, the ancestors of wheat and barley, until in the well-watered hills of the Near East, in an arc of country that runs from the Levant up through Anatolia and down along the flanks of the Zagros Mountains, there grew wild stands of cereal so rich that people could begin to linger near them. Why keep moving when the wild wheat ripened in such abundance right here that a few weeks of harvesting could feed you through the season? Some bands began to stay longer, to build more solid shelters, to store the wild grain against the lean months. They were not yet farmers. They were still gathering what grew wild, but they had begun to settle, and in settling they crossed, without knowing it, the first threshold. They began to accumulate. They began to stay. And on those well-fed, half-settled hillsides, among people who still hunted the gazelle and gathered the wild seed, but who no longer wandered as their ancestors had, something new was about to be born. We even have a name for some of these first settlers before farming in the Levant. The Natufians, who lived in the region around 12 to 15,000 years ago and who show us, in their remains, the very moment of transition caught in the act. The Natufians still hunted and gathered. They were not yet farmers, but they had begun to build round houses of stone, to live in them for much of the year, to bury their dead in cemeteries among their dwellings, to grind wild grain with stone mortars, to adorn themselves with beads and ornaments, to settle. They are the threshold people, caught between the two worlds. No longer the roaming bands of the deep past, not yet the farmers of the age to come, but something in between, lingering in the rich wild country, putting down the first roots of the settled life while still living off the wild. In their stone houses and their grinding stones and their cemeteries, we can see the old world beginning to end and the new one beginning to stir in the same people at the same time. The first hesitant, half-conscious steps across the great threshold, taken by people who could not have known that they were leaving the whole long human past behind them. And on those well-fed, half-settled hillsides, among people like the Natufians who still hunted the gazelle and gathered the wild seed, but who no longer wandered as their ancestors had, something new was about to be born. Something that would begin, astonishingly, not with a granary or a marketplace, but with a temple raised to the heavens by people who did not yet farm. To find it, we go now to the hills of Anatolia and to the great buried stones of Göbekli Tepe. Come back now to that dry hilltop in southeastern Turkey, near the modern city of Şanlıurfa, and to the mound called Göbekli Tepe. The name means, in Turkish, Potbelly Hill, for the rounded swell of it against the sky. For thousands of years it was just a hill, a low rise of earth with a lone mulberry tree on top, and the local farmers who ploughed its lower slopes turned up broken bits of worked flint and limestone and thought nothing of them. A survey in the 1960s noted the mound and dismissed it, probably a medieval cemetery. The surveyors thought, the stones just broken grave markers. And so it sat, unregarded, for another 30 years, until in 1994 a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, who had a hunch that the place was far older than anyone believed, came to look for himself. He picked up one of those broken grave markers, recognized the unmistakable working of the Stone Age in it, and understood in a flash that he was standing on something that could rewrite the human story. He would spend the rest of his life digging into that hill. What Schmidt and his team uncovered, over the years that followed, was staggering. Beneath the earth of the mound lay great oval and circular enclosures, rings of massive stone pillars set into the bedrock. The pillars are shaped like the letter T, a tall upright shaft topped by a broad horizontal cap, and the largest of them stand over 5 meters high and weigh in the neighborhood of 10 tons, with some estimates for the very largest running higher still. In the center of each ring stand 2 especially great pillars facing one another, and it slowly became clear that these were not just abstract shapes, they are stylized human figures, or something more than human. On some you can see arms carved in low relief, running down the sides of the shaft, with hands brought together over what would be the belly. You can see belts and loincloths hanging from them. The broad flat top is the head. These are beings, guardians, ancestors, gods, we do not know, rendered in stone taller than any man, standing eternal watch in the heart of the sanctuary. And they are covered in animals. Across the pillars of Göbekli Tepe, carved with real skill and confidence, prowls a whole bestiary of the wild, foxes with their long tails, boars with their tusks lowered, snakes descending in coiling ranks, scorpions, spiders, vultures with outspread wings, cranes, wild asses, aurochs, the huge and terrible wild cattle of the ancient world. There is almost nothing tame here. No sheep or goats or grain, because when these stones were carved, there were as yet no tame things. This is the imaginative world of the hunter, the forager, rendered in permanent stone, the dangerous, powerful, sacred animals of a world not yet domesticated. Some of the imagery is unsettling. A vulture that seems to carry a human head, headless figures, a recurring attention to death and to the carrion birds that attend it. Whatever these enclosures were for, they were not decorative. They were charged with meaning, with ritual, with a symbolic world we can glimpse, but not fully read. Now hold in your mind the thing that makes all of this almost impossible to believe. This was built around 9600 BC, and some of the surrounding activity may run even earlier. That is 11,500 years ago. The people who did it had no metal. Every one of those pillars was quarried from the living limestone and shaped using stone tools, hammerstones and flint, chipping and grinding away for who knows how many thousands of hours. They had no wheel and no draft animals, which means the multi-ton pillars were moved from the quarry to the rings by human muscle alone, by dozens or hundreds of people hauling on ropes and levers and sheer determination. They had no writing to plan with, no cities to organize the labor, no kings to command it, and this is the heart of it, no farms to feed the workers. Feeding a large group of people gathered in one place for heavy construction is a serious problem. It is exactly the kind of problem that farming and its surplus are supposed to solve. But there was no farming yet. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. Analysis of the vast quantities of animal bone left from their feasting shows wild game. Gazelle above all, along with wild boar, wild sheep, red deer, and the aurochs, and wild plants. These were foragers, and they built the first monumental sacred architecture in the history of the world. And then, after all that, after the quarrying and the hauling and the carving and the raising, after generations of use, they buried it, deliberately. The enclosures were not abandoned to slowly silt up. They were filled in, packed with rubble and refuse and earth by human hands, entombed under the hill. Sometimes an old enclosure was buried and a new one built nearby. Why they buried their temple is one more question the hill refuses to answer. Perhaps each was retired when its time was done, decommissioned by the same immense communal effort that raised it. Perhaps the burial was itself the point, the final and greatest ritual. We do not know. But the burying is why it survived. Why, 11,500 years later, a man with a hunch could dig into a hill and find, waiting in the dark, the oldest temple on earth, exactly where its makers had sealed it away. And Göbekli Tepe was not alone. As archaeologists have kept working across this region of southeastern Anatolia in the years since Schmidt's discovery, they have found that it was one of several such sites. That the impulse which raised it was not a single freak, but a whole tradition, a landscape dotted with early monumental sanctuaries of the same astonishing age. Nearby sites have yielded their own carved pillars and enclosures, their own strange sculptures, their own evidence of gathering and building by people at the very threshold of the settled world. Göbekli Tepe is the greatest and most famous of them, the one that broke the story open, but it now appears as the towering peak of a whole hidden range. A moment, in these hills, when human beings across a wide region were seized, for reasons we still cannot fully name, by the need to quarry great stones and carve the wild beasts upon them, and raise them into rings and gather in their shadow. Something was happening here, in these particular hills, at this particular hinge of time, that happened nowhere else on Earth so early. The very ground where wheat was first tamed was also the ground where humanity first built for its gods. Whatever the reason, the deepest roots of the whole built world run down into these Anatolian hills, into a handful of sanctuaries older than everything, raised by hunters and gatherers who then pulled the earth over them and passed on. Göbekli Tepe does more than break the old timeline. It forces a genuinely new and startling question about the deepest cause of civilization itself, and it is worth slowing down to feel the force of it, because this single hill may hold a clue to the whole mystery. Remember the old ladder: farming first, then surplus, then settlement, then, last of all, temples. Göbekli Tepe stands that ladder on its head. Here is a monumental temple built by people who had not yet taken the first step, who were still hunter-gatherers. The temple comes not at the end of the story, but, apparently, near the very beginning. And this suggested to Klaus Schmidt, and to many who have thought about the site since, a truly radical possibility, that we have had the whole causal story backwards, that it was not farming that made religion and monuments possible, that it might have been the reverse, that the need to gather, to build, to worship came first, and that farming was invented to feed it. Think about what it would take to build Göbekli Tepe. You would need to bring together, repeatedly, far more people than a single hunter-gatherer band. You would need hundreds of hands, drawn from across a wide region, assembling again and again over years to quarry and haul and carve and raise. Those gathered crowds would need to be fed, there on the barren hilltop, through the long labor. Gazelle and wild grain can feed a feast, but feeding large crowds reliably, again and again, in one fixed place, strains what wild foraging can provide. And here is the beautiful, tantalizing possibility. Perhaps it was precisely this need, the need to feed the faithful who gathered to build and worship, that drove people in the hills around Göbekli Tepe to begin the intensive management of the wild grains that would tip over, in time, into true farming. It cannot be an accident, some argue, that this very region, the hills of southeastern Anatolia, within sight of Göbekli Tepe, is exactly where the genetic and archaeological evidence says wheat was first domesticated. The wild ancestor of much of the world's cultivated wheat grows on these very slopes. The temple and the wheat field were born in the same small corner of the world at nearly the same time. Which came first, and which caused which, is the riddle. But the possibility that the temple came first, that humanity built its first great sacred place while still wild, and then invented farming to sustain the gatherings, is one of the most beautiful and disturbing ideas in all of archaeology. It suggests that civilization was born not from the belly, but from the spirit. Not from the practical need to eat, but from the human hunger to gather, to build, and to reach towards something larger than ourselves. It must be said, in honesty, that this is not proven, and that the picture has grown more complicated as the digging has continued. Newer work at Göbekli Tepe and at related sites nearby suggests the builders may not have been quite as purely nomadic as the first, dramatic version of the story implied. There are hints of more sustained settlement around the site, of the early intensive use of wild cereals, even of some of the earliest steps toward domestication happening right alongside the building. The neat, thrilling headline, "Hunter-gatherers built a temple and then invented farming to feed it," is being softened and complicated by careful scholars into something subtler. A long, entangled process in which building, gathering, feasting, settling, and the first management of wild plants all fed into one another over centuries in this rich and pivotal region until the threshold of true agriculture was crossed. But even in its more cautious form, the central shock of Göbekli Tepe remains. Monumental sacred architecture, the coordinated labor of hundreds, a rich, symbolic and religious world rendered in carved stone. All of this existed at or before the very dawn of farming, not long after it. The temple was there at the beginning. And whatever the exact sequence, Göbekli Tepe tells us that the first stirrings of civilization were bound up, from the start, with the invisible world of ritual and meaning, with the human need to come together in the presence of something sacred. The first monument was not a granary or a palace or a wall. It was a temple. And there is one more haunting detail worth holding on to from those buried rings, because it speaks to what may have driven the whole thing. The great central pillars, we said, are not abstract shapes but stylized beings, figures with arms and hands and belts, taller than any human, standing at the heart of each enclosure, whatever they represent. Ancestors, spirits, gods, the mighty dead. They suggest that at the very dawn of monumental building, before farming, before cities, before writing, human beings were already raising great stones to figures greater than themselves, gathering in the presence of the more than human, reaching across the boundary between the living and whatever lies beyond. The very first thing humanity built on a monumental scale was a place to stand before its gods or its ancestors. And that may be the deepest clue of all to the great why. Perhaps what first drew people together in the numbers that civilization required was not the need to eat, nor the search for safety, nor the logic of surplus, but something less tangible and more powerful. The need to gather in the presence of the sacred, to build a house for the holy, to stand together before the great figures of stone and feel themselves part of something vast and enduring. Perhaps, in the beginning, it was awe that built the world. We cannot prove it. But the oldest monument we have found is a temple raised by hunters to beings greater than themselves and then given back to the earth. And that is a remarkable thing for the human story to have at its very root. 1,000 years or so after the great stones of Göbekli Tepe were raised, and not very far away. Across the Anatolian peninsula, on a fertile plain in what is now south-central Turkey, human beings took the next great step. If Göbekli Tepe was a temple without a town, what rose at the site we call Çatalhöyük was a town without equal. One of the largest and most remarkable settlements of the early Neolithic world, a honeycomb of houses packed together on the plain, home at its height to something like 5,000 to 8,000 people. It was inhabited for well over 1,000 years, from around 7,100 BC, and to walk through it, if you could, would be to walk through one of the strangest and most intimate glimpses we have of what it was like when humanity first learned to live in great numbers in one place. The first strange thing about Çatalhöyük is that it had no streets. The houses were built directly against one another, wall sharing wall, in a dense continuous mass with no roads or alleys running between them. So how did people move through the town, and how did they get into their homes? Over the roofs. The rooftops of Çatalhöyük, all at slightly different levels, formed the town's true thoroughfares. A continuous rolling surface of flat clay roofs across which people walked, worked, and gathered, with ladders leading down into the houses through openings in the ceiling. You entered your home by climbing down through a hole in the roof, past the hearth, into the single main room where your family lived. Inside, the house was a single multi-purpose room, its walls and floors regularly replastered and kept scrupulously clean. The archaeologists can count the layers of fresh white plaster, applied year after year, like the rings of a tree, and read in them the long life of a house tended across generations. Raised platforms along the walls served for sitting, working, and sleeping, and it was beneath these platforms that the dead were laid. A hearth and an oven near the entry hole provided heat and cooking, their smoke rising up and out through the same opening that served as the door, which is why the walls and ceilings were often black with soot. There were bins for storing grain, niches and installations in the walls, obsidian blades and bone tools and pottery, the ordinary furniture of a settled life. Light came dimly through the roof hole and perhaps through small high openings. The interior would have been dark, smoky, close and warm, a snug cave of human making. It was not a comfortable home by our standards, but it was a real one, a permanent, tended, inherited place, lived in by the same family across generations, its floors holding the family's dead, its walls holding the family's history in layers of plaster and paint. After 200,000 years of shelters that lasted a season, human beings had made, at last, a home that lasted a lifetime and beyond. The town, seen from above, would have been a landscape of rooftops busy with people and dotted with the smoke holes of 1,000 hearths. The town, seen from within, a warren of snug, dark, smoke-stained rooms, each one a world. And in those rooms, the people of Çatalhöyük lived alongside their dead. When someone died, they were not carried out to a cemetery beyond the town. They were buried beneath the floor of the house, under the raised platforms where the family slept. Archaeologists excavating the houses have found, again and again, the bones of the dead tucked beneath the living, sometimes many individuals under a single home, interred over generations. Sometimes the skull was later dug up, separated from the body, and kept. And in some remarkable cases plastered and painted, the features of the dead modelled back onto the bare bone in clay, the face of an ancestor remade to be held and honoured and kept close. The line between the living household and the ancestral dead was not a wall or a distance, it was the floor beneath their feet. The family and its forebears occupied the same small sacred space, the quick and the dead together under one roof. The houses were also, many of them, filled with a dense and vivid symbolic world. The people of Çatalhöyük painted their walls, with geometric patterns, with hunting scenes, with vultures descending on headless human figures, echoing across 1,000 years and many miles the same preoccupation with death and carrion birds we saw at Göbekli Tepe. They modelled the heads of aurochs, the great wild cattle, and mounted them on the walls, the actual horns sheathed in plaster, so that the bull's power projected into the room. They shaped figurines, including the famous heavy female forms that some have read as goddesses of fertility and others as something more ordinary, and that we, in honesty, cannot fully interpret. Certain rooms are so thick with this symbolic furniture, the bull horns, the paintings, the plastered skulls, the burials, that scholars once called them shrines and imagined a separate priestly quarter. The current view is subtler and stranger, that there may have been no separate temples at all, that the sacred was woven into the ordinary house, that every home was, in its way, a shrine, its walls and floor alive with ancestors and animals and the powers of the world. At Çatalhöyük, religion had no separate address. It lived where the people lived, in the smoke and the dark, beneath the sleeping platforms, behind the horns of the bull. For all its size, Çatalhöyük shows us something else that matters for our story. It was strikingly equal and strikingly without hierarchy. The houses are much alike. There is no palace, no grand residence towering over the rest, no obvious temple complex commanding the town, no sign of a king or a ruling class or a central authority directing everything from above. The homes are similar in size and construction and contents. The differences between them are modest. Here were thousands of people living packed together for 1,000 years, and yet they seem to have done it without the steep pyramids of power, the kings and priests and nobles and slaves that we usually associate with large settled populations. This is a profound and important fact, and we will return to it. The first great gatherings of humanity were not necessarily the first tyrannies. For a long time, in places like Çatalhöyük, people found ways to live together in the thousands while remaining, as their wandering ancestors had been, roughly equal. The steep hierarchy, the king on his ziggurat, the god-ruler and his taxes and his armies. That was coming. But it was not here yet. Çatalhöyük is the great town before the great inequality, the crowd before the crown. Underneath the temple at Göbekli Tepe and the painted town at Çatalhöyük runs the single most important change in the entire human story: more important, in its consequences, than any war or empire or invention that came after, because everything else grew out of it. It is the change we call, a little grandly, the Neolithic Revolution, the shift from finding food to growing it, from hunting and gathering to farming and herding. It sounds simple, almost dull, put that way. It was neither. It was the great bargain humanity struck with the earth and with itself, and like all the deepest bargains, it gave enormously and it took enormously, and we are still, 12,000 years later, living inside its terms. It did not happen as a sudden invention, a light bulb over one clever head. It happened slowly, over many centuries, as an unbroken series of small choices whose vast cumulative consequence no one could have foreseen. It began, as we have seen, with gathering, with people harvesting the wild grains that grew so thickly in the hills of the Fertile Crescent, that great arc of well-watered country curving from the Levant up through Anatolia and down through the Zagros. As people lingered near the richest wild stands, they began, without quite deciding to tend them, clearing competing plants, perhaps scattering seed in good ground, coming back each year to the same patches. And because they naturally harvested and carried and replanted the seeds of the best plants, the ones whose grain was biggest, whose stalks held the seed instead of shattering it to the wind, they began, unconsciously, to change the plants themselves. Generation by generation, the wild grasses bent toward domestication, bigger seeds, tougher stalks that held the grain for the harvester, more reliable ripening. The wheat became dependent on humans to spread it. The humans became dependent on the wheat to feed them. Neither had planned this. They had grown into each other over centuries in a slow embrace that neither could now escape. And the same thing happened with animals. The wild sheep and goats and, later, cattle and pigs, penned and tended and bred toward tameness, toward docility and wool and milk and meat, until the wild thing became the domestic thing, and the herder and the herd were bound together as tightly as the farmer and the field. What did the bargain give? Everything that this whole night is about. Farming, once established, could feed far more people from far less land than foraging ever could. A given patch of ground, planted with grain, could support many times the population it could feed as wild country. And so populations grew and kept growing. The surplus of the fields turned into a surplus of people. That surplus of food and people is the ground from which every later thing sprang. Because once a society could produce more food than its farmers needed to survive, it could feed people who did not farm at all, full-time potters and weavers and toolmakers, and then full-time priests and soldiers and rulers and scribes. The surplus made specialization possible, and specialization made everything else possible. Craft, art, monumental building, organized religion, writing, government, war. The city, the temple, the empire, the written word, all of them stand, ultimately, on the grain heaped in the storehouse, on the simple, revolutionary fact that a farmer could grow more than a farmer needed to eat. But the bargain also took, and it is only honest to name the cost, because it was steep, and it fell hardest on the very people whose labor made the surplus. The skeletons tell the tale. Compared with their hunter-gatherer ancestors, early farmers were often shorter, and showed more signs of malnutrition, of nutritional disease, of a monotonous grain-heavy diet lacking the varied richness of the forager's table. They worked harder. Farming, especially early farming, is brutal, endless labor, the grinding round of planting and weeding and harvesting and threshing and grinding, dawn to dusk, season after season. They fell sick more easily and in new ways, crowded together in permanent settlements, living close to their animals and their own waste. They suffered epidemics and parasites and plagues that the mobile, dispersed foragers had largely escaped. Many of the great infectious diseases of human history first leapt to us from the domestic animals we now lived pressed against. And there was a subtler cost, a social one, that we have already glimpsed at Çatalhöyük, and that would come into its full, terrible flower in the cities to come. Farming, with its fields and its stored surplus, created for the first time things that could be owned, hoarded, monopolized, and fought over. Land could be held, granaries could be seized, wealth could be accumulated and passed down. And so, in time, the rough equality of the forager band gave way to the steep hierarchies of the farming world, to landlords and laborers, rulers and ruled, rich and poor, free and enslaved. Foraging had few kings because it had little to rule. Farming built the throne. This is the great bargain, and notice that it was not really a choice. No one sat down and weighed the terms and signed. It happened gradually, each small step sensible on its own, until humanity found itself deep inside a new way of life from which there was no going back, because there were now far too many people to feed by foraging alone. The farmers could not return to the forest even if they had wanted to. The wild could not feed their multiplied millions. Humanity had, without deciding to, bound itself to the plough. And it is worth dwelling on how invisible the change was to the people living through it, because it holds a lesson about how the largest transformations in human life actually happen. No one in the Fertile Crescent woke one morning and announced the invention of agriculture. No council debated whether to abandon the freedom of the forest for the toil of the field. The change unfolded across hundreds of years, dozens of generations, each of them making small, sensible, local decisions. To tend this rich patch of wild grain a little more carefully, to come back to it next season, to clear a few competing plants, to save some of the best seed, to build a more solid storehouse, to stay a little longer in one place. Not one of these choices was a leap into a new way of life. Each was a small, reasonable step from the life already being lived. And yet the sum of all those small steps, across all those generations, was the most complete transformation of the human condition that had ever occurred. A species remade, from wanderer to farmer, from forager to citizen, without any single person ever choosing the destination or even seeing it. The people who took the last steps into full farming were born into a world already half transformed by the steps their ancestors had taken, and they took the next steps as naturally as their parents had taken the last, and so humanity walked, one small, sensible stride at a time, out of the world it had known for 200,000 years and into an entirely new one, never seeing the whole of what it was doing until the doing was long done. And on the surplus that plough produced, in the great river valleys where the soil was richest and the harvests largest, the first cities were about to rise. And with them, kings, gods, writing, and the beginning of what we call history. We go now down out of the hills and follow the water to the land between two rivers. We have come a long way already tonight, up out of the deep human past, onto the hills of Anatolia, into the buried temple and the painted town, and through the slow, great turning of the Neolithic bargain. Before we follow the rivers down into the first true cities, the story pauses here, on the Anatolian uplands, in the pale hour before sunrise, and simply rests a while among the first fields humanity ever planted. It is very early on the hills. The night is thinning toward dawn, and the sky over the eastern ridges has begun to lighten from black to the deep blue of the last hour before the sun, and then, along the rim of the hills, to a band of grey, and then of palest gold. The air is cool and still and smells of earth and dew and the cold ash of last night's fires. Below, on the gentle slopes, lie the first fields. Small, irregular plots of tended grain, the wild wheat and barley that these people have coaxed. Season by season, a little further from the wild, the heavy heads of grain, grey and heavy with the morning damp, bowing on their stalks. Here and there a low stone wall, a cleared patch, a path worn between the plots by bare feet over many years. It is the newest thing in the world, this patchwork of planted ground, and also, already, the oldest human labour there is. Someone rose in the dark, walked out to the fields, and stood looking at the growing grain, as farmers would stand and look for the next 12,000 years, down to this very morning. The settlement sleeps behind and below, a cluster of mud and stone houses gathering the last of the night's shadow, thin threads of smoke beginning to rise from banked hearths as the earliest risers wake and feed the fires. A dog barks once, far off, and falls silent. A bird begins, tentative, in a thorn bush, and then another. The great flocks of the wild birds move across the paling sky toward the water. And over it all, over the fields and the sleeping houses and the waking birds, the light comes up slow and even and gold, the way it has come up over these hills every morning for all the tens of thousands of years that people have lived among them. But now, for the first time, it rises over planted fields, over grain that grows because human hands put it there, over a world that people have begun, in a small and world-changing way, to make instead of merely to find. There is a great quiet in that thought and a great rest. In standing at the very beginning of the long human labor of the fields, in the cool gold hour before the work begins, when the grain is heavy with dew and the world is new, and the whole vast story of cities and kings and writing still lies ahead, unimagined in the ripening dark of the future. The first farmers did not know what they had begun. They knew only the field and the grain and the coming day and the light rising gold over the hills as it rises now. A woman comes out from one of the houses with a clay jar to fetch water, her breath faintly visible in the cool air, and stands a moment looking at the fields and the climbing light before she goes down to the spring, as people have stood a moment in the doorway of the morning, caught by the beauty of the ordinary dawn in every age since. The smoke rises straight and blue in the windless air. The dew lies silver on the grain. Far off, the first of the flocks are being let out to graze, small figures moving on the pale hillside. It is a morning like the first morning, at the beginning of the settled world, and it is also a morning like this one, like every one, the light coming up gold and even over a waking human place, over the fields and the houses and the smoke and the flocks, in the deep peace of the day's beginning. The first farmers did not know what they had begun. They knew only the field and the grain and the coming day and the light rising gold over the hills as it rises now. Rest here a while, in that first dawn, before we follow the water down. The light is climbing. The grain is bowing under its silver weight of dew. And somewhere down the long slope of the years, out of just such quiet mornings as this one, the first cities are waiting to be born. Follow the water south and east, down out of the Anatolian highlands where the two great rivers are born, and you come at last to the land they made. A long, flat, hot alluvial plain running down to the Persian Gulf, a land that would become the stage for the first true cities on earth. The Greeks would later give it a name that has stuck ever since: Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. The rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates, and everything that happened here. The cities, the temples, the writing, the kings, happened because of them, and in a constant, difficult negotiation with them. The two rivers rise in the mountains of the north, in the snowmelt of the Anatolian and Armenian highlands, and run roughly parallel down the length of the plain before joining near the Gulf. As they descend, they carry with them an immense burden of silt, fine, fertile soil eroded from the mountains upstream and held in their muddy waters. Each year, swollen by the spring melt, the rivers overflow their banks and spread across the flat land, and when the floods recede, they leave behind a fresh layer of that silt, a renewed skin of some of the most fertile soil on earth. This is the gift. In the dry heart of the Near East, where the rains are too thin to farm by, the rivers bring both water and fertility down from the mountains and lay them across the plain, and where human beings can capture and direct that water, the desert blooms with an abundance almost beyond belief. The soil of southern Mesopotamia, watered by the rivers, could produce grain in quantities the rain-fed hills of Anatolia could never match. Here was the richest agricultural ground in the ancient world, but only for those who could master it, because the gift came wrapped in a challenge, and it was the challenge, as much as the gift, that built civilization here. The rivers were not gentle or reliable. The Tigris especially was wild and unpredictable, its floods violent and badly timed, coming often in the spring when the harvest was ripe rather than when the seed went in. The rivers changed their courses, wandering across the flat plain, drowning fields one decade and abandoning them the next. And the rain on the southern plain was too scarce to grow the grain alone. To farm this land, to turn its potential wealth into actual bread, people could not simply scatter seed and wait, as they could in the well-watered hills. They had to take control of the water itself. They had to dig canals to carry the river water out to the fields, and dikes to hold back the floods, and basins to store the water against the dry season, and ditches to drain the land before the standing water turned its salt and killed it. And all of this, the digging, the maintaining, the constant repair, the management of who got water and when, could not be done by a single family or a single household. It required many hands, working together, under some kind of coordination and agreement and authority. The very difficulty of the land forced the people on it to organize, to cooperate on a large scale, to submit to the discipline of the common waterworks. The rivers gave the richest soil in the world, but only to those who would band together to control them. And in that banding together, in the collective mastery of the water, lay the seed of the city, the temple, the king, and the state. So the pattern of Mesopotamian life was set by the rivers from the beginning. Fabulous fertility, purchased by relentless collective labor under the constant shadow of flood and drought and the ever-present threat of the salt. It was a land that rewarded organization and punished disorder, that made cooperation not a virtue but a necessity of survival. And it exacted, over the long centuries, a slow and terrible price that the first farmers could not have foreseen: the price of salt. For irrigation in a hot, flat land carries a hidden poison. The river water spread across the fields carries dissolved salts, and under the burning Mesopotamian sun, much of that water evaporates before it drains away, leaving its salt behind in the soil. Year after year, century after century, the salt accumulated in the irrigated fields, invisibly at first, then in a pale crust on the ground, until the land grew too salty to bear the crops it once had. The records of ancient Mesopotamia trace the slow disaster in the harvest accounts. Over the long span, the more salt-sensitive wheat had to be given up across much of the south in favor of the more tolerant barley, and even the barley yields, on the worst land, sank over the centuries as the salt crept up. Fields that had fed cities went white and sterile and were abandoned. It was one of the first times, but very far from the last, that a civilization, in the act of wringing abundance from the earth, slowly undermined the very ground it stood on, poisoning its own fields by the same irrigation that fed it. The land between the rivers gave the richest harvests in the world, and took, in the salt, a patient and inexorable revenge across the millennia. It is one of the oldest lessons the first cities have to teach, and one of the most quietly relevant to our own age. That the mastery of nature is never as complete or as free of cost as it first appears, and that the bill for it may come due slowly, over centuries, long after the ones who ran it up are gone. And it was here, on this demanding and generous plain, among people who had come down from the hills carrying the hard-won knowledge of farming and building and the first stirrings of settled life, that humanity would take the last great step. From the village to the city, from the town to the state, from prehistory into history itself. It began, as so much did here, with a temple in the mud. The Sumerians themselves, the people who built the first cities of the southern Mesopotamian plain, remembered, in their myths, that there had been a first city before all others, a place where kingship and civilization had first descended from the heavens to the earth. They called it Eridu, and remarkably, when archaeologists went looking, they found that the myth pointed at something real. The site of Eridu, in the deep south of the plain near the ancient shore of the Gulf, contains some of the oldest urban remains in Mesopotamia, with occupation reaching back to around 5400 BC, making it, by some reckonings, the oldest city in the world, or at least the oldest the Sumerians themselves believed in. At the heart of Eridu, across the whole immense span of its life, stood a temple, and the story of that temple is the story of Mesopotamian civilization in miniature. It began around 5000 BC as almost nothing, a tiny one-room shrine of mud brick, a few meters on a side, a modest little sacred house set on the ground. It was dedicated to Enki, the god of fresh water and of wisdom, the very god of the water that made life on the plain possible, the cunning, benevolent god who, in the Sumerian imagination, gave humanity the arts of civilization. And here is the extraordinary thing: that little shrine was never simply abandoned. When it grew old, the people did not tear it down and start elsewhere. They buried it, carefully, and built a new and slightly grander temple directly on top of it, on the same spot, keeping the sacred place exactly where it had always been. And when that temple aged, they did the same again, and again, and again. Across thousands of years, generation after generation rebuilt the temple of Enki on the ruins of the temple before, each one larger and more elaborate than the last, until the humble one-room shrine at the bottom lay, buried beneath a towering platform of accumulated sacred building. The whole mounting structure, a physical record, layer on layer, of the unbroken devotion of 100 generations to the same God in the same place. By the time it reached its height, the Temple of Eridu stood on a great raised platform, the direct ancestor of the ziggurats to come. In that single, continuously rebuilt sacred spot, you can see the whole Mesopotamian pattern. The deep-rootedness in place, the temple at the center of everything, the past never discarded but built upon, the sacred accumulating like the silt of the rivers into something monumental. And the Sumerians wove their own beginning into their sacred stories, remembering, dimly, mythically, but not without a core of truth. That civilization itself had been a gift, handed to humanity at the dawn of time. In their myths, the arts of civilized life, the very institutions we have watched them invent, were the me. The divine ordinances, the sacred patterns of civilized existence, kingship and priesthood and craft and law and writing and all the rest, which the gods had established and which humanity had received from them. They told of Enki, the wise god of Eridu, dispensing these gifts of civilization. They told of the first kings, before a great flood, to whom kingship had descended from heaven, ruling for fantastic spans of years in the first cities. Buried in these myths, beneath the fabulous numbers and the divine machinery, is a real memory. That civilization had a beginning, that there was a time before cities and a time after, that the settled, ordered life of the temple and the field was a new thing that had come into the world at a particular moment, in particular places, of which Eridu was remembered as the first. The Sumerians, standing only a few thousand years from the threshold themselves, still remembered, as we, standing 5,000 years further on, are only now rediscovering, that the world of cities was not eternal, that it had been born, that there was a beginning. Their myths of the me and the first kings and the gift of civilization are, in their strange way, the oldest human attempt to tell the very story we are telling tonight. How did it all begin? Eridu shows us the seed. But the flower, the first city that was truly a city, in the full, overwhelming sense of the word, grew a little to the north, on the banks of the Euphrates, at a place whose name deserves to be as famous as Rome or Athens, because it was, quite simply, first. Its name was Uruk. Around 4000 BC, on the banks of the Euphrates, a settlement began to grow that would become something the world had never seen before. Over the following centuries, it swelled with astonishing speed, drawing people in from the surrounding countryside and the smaller towns, concentrating them behind its walls in numbers that had no precedent in the whole history of the human species. By around 3200 BC, the city of Uruk covered some 600 hectares and held a population that scholars estimate at 40,000, perhaps 50,000, souls. Try to feel what that number meant at that moment in history. For 200,000 years, human beings had lived in bands of dozens and, latterly, in towns of a few thousand at the very most. Now, on the Mesopotamian plain, tens of thousands of people were living together in a single place, the largest concentration of humanity that had ever existed on the face of the earth. Uruk was not a big village. It was a new kind of thing entirely. It was the first city. And living in it required solving problems no human community had ever faced. How do you feed 40,000 people, day after day, who do not grow their own food? How do you bring in the grain, and store it, and distribute it? How do you supply water, remove waste, organize the labor of the canals on which all the food depends? How do you settle the countless disputes that arise when that many strangers? For in a city of 40,000, most people are strangers, another entirely new experience, must live packed together? How do you defend such a concentration of wealth and people? How do you coordinate it all? The answers to these questions are, essentially, the institutions of civilization itself, and Uruk was the place where humanity first invented them under the sheer overwhelming pressure of the crowd. The city forced into being the things we have lived with ever since. Centralized administration, social hierarchy, full-time specialists, organized religion on a grand scale, monumental public building, concentrated political power. And, as we shall see, writing itself. And it forced into being, too, an entirely new kind of human experience. The experience of living among strangers. In the old world of the band and the village, a person knew everyone they would ever meet. The whole of their society was a web of faces they recognized, kin and neighbors bound by a lifetime of shared knowledge. In Uruk, for the first time, a person walked daily among thousands they did not know and would never know. Anonymous crowds, unfamiliar faces, the press of the unknown multitude that is the very texture of city life and that had never existed before in the history of the species. This was a profound change in the human condition. It meant that order could no longer rest on personal knowledge and kinship alone, on everyone knowing everyone. It had to rest on something new, on law, on authority, on institutions, on the impersonal machinery of the state, which could govern the relations of strangers who had no personal bond. The city of strangers required the invention of impersonal order, and so it built the first great apparatus of administration and law and centralized power. To live in Uruk was to live, for the first time, the characteristic life of civilization ever since. Surrounded by multitudes, most of them strangers, held together not by the warm bonds of the face-to-face band, but by the cooler, vaster, more powerful bonds of the state, the market, the temple, and the written record. We have lived that life ever since, and it began here, in the first great city, among the first crowds of strangers the world had ever known. The skyline of Uruk was dominated by two great sacred precincts, two temple complexes raised to two of the great gods, one to Anu, the remote high god of the sky, and one to Inanna, the fierce and magnificent goddess of love and war, the most compelling deity of the Sumerian world, whose city Uruk was. These were not the little shrines of Eridu's beginning. These were vast monumental complexes, raised on huge platforms, built of millions of mud bricks by the organized labor of thousands, decorated with columns and mosaics and every art the age could muster, towering over the flat plain as a visible proclamation of the city's wealth and the god's power and the sheer collective might of the community that could raise such things. To a traveler coming across the flat land from some small village, the temples of Uruk rising on the horizon must have been the most overwhelming sight in the world. And Uruk knew its own greatness and remembered it. For Uruk was the city of Gilgamesh, the half-legendary king who became the hero of the world's first great work of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, written down in Mesopotamia and recopied for well over 1,000 years. And the very first thing the epic praises, in its opening lines, is not the hero's strength or his adventures, but his city's walls. The great ramparts of Uruk, which the poet invites the listener to climb and walk upon and admire, marveling at their fired brick and their vast circuit, the work of the king and the pride of the city. It is a remarkable thing. The oldest surviving epic in human literature opens by boasting of a city wall, because to the people of the first cities, the wall, the vast, deliberate, collective work that enclosed and defined and protected the urban world, was itself a wonder worth singing, the proudest achievement of the proudest city on earth. The traveller coming across the plain and the poet singing across the millennia agreed, Uruk and its walls and its towering temples were the marvel of the world, the ancient equivalent of a first glimpse of a skyline of towers, a statement that here, in this place, human beings had gathered and organized themselves into something greater and more powerful than anything the world had known. The temple was the heart of the city. Not only its religious center, but its economic and administrative one, a vast institution that owned land, employed labor, stored the grain, managed the surplus, and kept, in its storerooms and offices, the accounts of the whole complex urban economy. And it was there, in the temple accounts of Uruk, out of the sheer need to keep track of who owed what and who received what in a community grown too large and too complex for any memory to hold, that humanity stumbled into its single most powerful invention. Of all the things the first cities gave us, and they gave us nearly everything, none is greater than the one that was born, around 3200 BC, in the temple storerooms of Uruk. It did not look like a world-changing invention. It looked like accounting. But it was writing, and with it, humanity gained a kind of memory that could outlast the living mind, and history itself began. Think about the problem it solved. In a city of 40,000, the temple institution was managing an economy of staggering complexity, receiving grain from countless fields, storing it, distributing rations to countless workers, tracking herds of animals, quantities of wool and oil and beer, the labor owed and the labor done. No human memory, however good, could hold it all. The old methods, knotted cords, notched tallies, and above all little clay tokens of different shapes standing for different goods, sealed in clay envelopes, could count and record, but clumsily, and only just. As the city grew, the pressure mounted for something better, some way to fix information outside the fragile and forgetful human head, to make a record that would stay put and stay true. And the scribes of Uruk found it. They began pressing signs into the surface of wet clay tablets with the trimmed end of a reed. First, simple pictures, a drawing of an ox head to mean an ox, of a stalk of grain to mean grain, marks for numbers alongside them. A tablet could now say, and hold, and carry across time, so many measures of barley received from such a person on such an account. The information was no longer trapped in a mind that would forget and a mouth that would fall silent. It was fixed in fired clay, permanent, checkable, endlessly durable. Humanity had learned to remember outside itself, and then, having invented it for the barley accounts, they discovered what they had really made. Because writing, once born, could not be kept in the storeroom. The early picture signs were cumbersome, and the scribes quickly streamlined them. The curved lines of the drawings gave way to combinations of straight strokes and wedge-shaped marks, pressed swiftly and cleanly into the clay with the corner of the reed stylus, because wedges were faster and clearer in clay than curves. This wedge writing is what we call cuneiform, from the Latin for wedge, and over centuries it grew from a limited accounting tool into a full and flexible system that could capture the whole of spoken language. The great breakthrough came when scribes realized that a sign could stand not just for a thing but for a sound, that the sign for a word could be used, like a rebus, to spell out the sound of that word wherever it occurred, even in a name or an abstract idea that could not be drawn. Once signs could represent sounds, writing broke free of the storeroom entirely. Now anything that could be said could be written. Not just how many sheep, but the names of kings, the words of the gods, the terms of a law, the lines of a poem, the story of a hero. The account keeper's tool became the vessel of everything: literature, history, religion, science, law. Humanity's whole inner life, its memory and its imagination, could now be poured into clay and passed down across the centuries to people not yet born. It is worth pausing on the sheer magnitude of what this meant, because it is the reason we can tell this story at all. Before writing, human memory reached back only as far as the oldest living person's recollection of what the previous old people had told them. A few generations, growing vague and mythical at the edges, and then darkness. Everything before that was lost, permanently, forever. With writing, for the first time, a human being could hear the actual words of someone dead 1,000 years. The voices of the past could speak. A Sumerian scribe's tally of barley, a king's boast carved in stone, a scholar's list of stars, a poet's lament for a fallen city. These could survive their makers by millennia and be read again by strangers in an unimaginable future. This is the moment prehistory ends and history begins, not because the events before were less real, but because now, at last, the people speak to us in their own words across the abyss of time. When you read tonight of Sumerian kings and Egyptian pharaohs and the deeds and thoughts of the ancient world, you are reading because a harried temple accountant in Uruk 5,000 years ago needed a better way to count sacks of grain, and in finding it gave humanity the power to remember itself. And around that invention grew the first schools in the history of the world. Because writing was difficult. Hundreds of signs, complex rules, a whole demanding craft. It had to be taught systematically to the boys who would become the scribes on whom the whole administration of the city depended. And so Mesopotamia created the institution of the school, which they called, wonderfully, the Tablet House. There, young scribes in training spent years learning their craft, copying out sign lists and standard texts over and over onto practice tablets, memorizing, reciting, and being drilled by their teachers. Some of those practice tablets survive, and they are strangely moving. The clumsy early efforts of a child learning the signs, sometimes with the teacher's neat model on one side and the student's wobbling copy on the other. There even survive tablets on which Sumerian schoolboys grumbled, in writing, about their school days. About the strictness of the teacher, the beatings for a careless stroke or a moment's lateness or talking out of turn, the long, hard hours of copying. Across 5,000 years, the voice of a bored, aggrieved schoolboy comes through the clay as clear as yesterday, complaining about his teacher exactly as a child might today. It is one of the small, human miracles that writing made possible. Not only the deeds of kings, but the grumbles of children, preserved and speaking still from the very dawn of the written world. Of all the gifts of the first cities, this is the one that made all the others speak. The first cities were, above all, sacred places. To understand Sumer, and through it, the shape that early civilization took nearly everywhere, you have to understand that its people did not draw the line we draw between the religious and the practical, the temple and the state, the divine and the earthly. For the Sumerians, the city belonged, quite literally, to a god. Uruk was Inanna's. Eridu was Enki's. The city of Nippur belonged to Enlil, the mighty lord of the air. The god owned the land, the fields, the people. The great temple was the god's own house, where the deity dwelt and was fed and clothed and served, and the whole apparatus of the city. Its economy, its labor, its harvest, was understood as the estate of the god, managed on the god's behalf. Religion was not one department of Sumerian life. It was the frame that held all the rest. The Sumerian gods were many, and they were vivid, and they were not comfortable or gentle beings. They were the powers of the world made into persons: the sky, the air, the fresh water, the storm, the grain, the morning star, and they were as vast, as capricious, and as dangerous as the forces they embodied. Anu was the high god of heaven, remote and supreme. Enlil, lord of wind and storm, was the active king of the gods, the one who granted kingship to men and could destroy them with his tempests. Enki, god of the sweet water and of wisdom, was humanity's cunning friend and benefactor, the giver of the civilized arts. And Inanna, later called Ishtar, was the most electrifying of them all, goddess at once of love and of war, of desire and of destruction, a figure of overwhelming power and passion whose myths of descent into the underworld and conflict with the other gods are among the oldest and greatest stories humanity has ever told. These gods had to be served, fed, housed, praised, and obeyed through an unceasing round of ritual and offering conducted by a professional priesthood in the great temples, because on the gods' goodwill depended everything: the flood that came in time or too late, the harvest that swelled or failed, the city that prospered or fell to its enemies. In a world so utterly at the mercy of forces beyond human control, the fickle rivers, the merciless sun, the uncertain rains, the management of the divine was not superstition but the most serious and practical business there was, and it reached into every corner of ordinary life. The great gods had their vast temples and their professional priesthoods, but beneath them swarmed a whole host of lesser gods and spirits and demons, presiding over every trade and every doorway and every stage of life, and the ordinary Sumerian moved through a world densely crowded with the divine. There were personal gods, household gods, whom a family served and looked to for protection and good fortune, much as later ages would keep their household shrines and patron saints. There were demons to be warded off with charms and incantations, illnesses understood as the work of malign spirits, misfortunes read as signs of divine displeasure to be set right with the proper offering. Ordinary people brought their small gifts and their prayers to the gods, much as they brought their disputes to the king's justice, as the necessary business of getting through a dangerous and uncertain life under powers far greater than themselves. Religion was not a thing set apart for holy days. It was the very air the first cities breathed, the constant negotiation between fragile human beings and the vast, capricious powers that held their lives, their harvests, and their deaths in unseen hands. And out of the service of the gods grew the institution that would rule the human world for the next 5,000 years: kingship. The earliest leaders of the Sumerian cities seem to have been essentially priestly figures, the chief servants and stewards of the city's god, ruling as the deity's earthly managers. The Sumerians had a word, Un, for such a priestly ruler. But as the cities grew, and grew rich, and began to compete and to war with one another over land and water and power, a second kind of leader rose alongside the priest. The war leader, the strong man, the one the Sumerians called Lugal. Literally, big man, who led the city's forces in battle and defended it in crisis. In troubled times, the war leader's temporary power tended to become permanent. The successful Lugal held on to his authority after the danger passed, made it hereditary, passed it to his sons, and so became a king in the full sense. A permanent, dynastic, secular ruler, Though one who still drew his legitimacy from the gods, who ruled, he always claimed, by divine appointment, as the gods' chosen shepherd of the people. Priest and king, temple and palace, would coexist and sometimes compete for the rest of Mesopotamian history, but together they formed the double crown of the new order, the god in his temple and the king in his palace, the sacred and the political power, ruling the city between them. The rough equality of Çatalhöyük was gone. The age of kings had come. The physical symbol of this whole sacred order was the structure that still, more than any other, says ancient Mesopotamia to the modern eye, the ziggurat. As the temples grew across the centuries, rebuilt again and again on their own ruins in the way we saw at Eridu, they rose ever higher until they became great stepped towers of mud brick, artificial sacred mountains climbing in terraces toward the sky. The ziggurat was not a temple you entered like a hall. It was a solid mountain of brick, with a small shrine at its summit, a stairway to heaven raising the god's house high above the flat plain, closer to the realm of the sky gods, visible for miles across the level land as the beating heart of the city. The greatest of them, like the famous ziggurat of rose 30 meters and more above the plain, their bulk incorporating millions upon millions of individually made mud bricks, their construction representing the organized labor of thousands over years, the single most massive and impressive thing in the Sumerian world, and a statement, written in brick against the sky, of the power of the gods, and the might of the city and the king who served them. When you picture the first cities, picture this above all: the great stepped tower rising from the huddle of mud brick houses, catching the last gold light of evening on its summit, where the god dwelt above his people, and the smoke of the offerings rose toward the darkening sky. While the priests served the gods and the kings raised their ziggurats, in the workshops and the fields and along the riverbanks of Sumer, a quieter revolution was unfolding. A burst of practical invention so consequential that we still use its fruits every day. The first cities were not only the birthplace of writing and kingship and organized religion, they were also humanity's first great engine of technology, and the innovations that poured out of Mesopotamia in these centuries reshaped what human beings could do in the physical world. Consider the wheel, so basic to us that we forget it had to be invented, that for the overwhelming majority of human history it did not exist. It seems to have emerged in Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions in the 4th millennium BC, and, tellingly, it may have come not from transport, but from the pottery workshop. The potter's wheel, a heavy disc spun on an axle to shape clay with a speed and symmetry no hand could match, appears early, and the leap from a wheel that spins clay to a wheel that rolls a cart is the kind of leap the crowded, inventive city was uniquely good at making. The earliest cartwheels were solid discs of wood, heavy and crude, but they moved loads that no human back could carry, and in time they were refined, lightened, and eventually, centuries later, spoked, until the wheel became the basis of the cart, the wagon, and the war chariot that would thunder across the battlefields of the ancient world. The wheel is Mesopotamia's gift, and it has been rolling ever since. Consider the plough, which multiplied the power of the farmer as the wheel multiplied the power of the porter. A digging stick or a hoe breaks the ground one small bite at a time by human muscle. A plough, dragged through the earth, cuts a continuous furrow and turns the soil, and when it was harnessed, as it soon was, to the pulling power of oxen, it allowed a single farmer to work an area that would have exhausted a whole family with hand tools. The ox-drawn plough put the muscle of the great domestic animals to work in the fields and multiplied the surplus that fed the cities and remained, in its essentials, the basis of agriculture for the next 5,000 years until the coming of the machine. Consider the sailing boat, which put the power of the wind to work on the water, letting the reed and wooden craft of the rivers and the Gulf carry heavy cargoes over long distances without the endless labor of paddling and poling, and so knit the cities into networks of trade that reached, in time, across seas. Consider the potter's kiln, the loom, the systematic irrigation works, the beginnings of metallurgy, the working first of soft native copper and then, in the great breakthrough, of bronze, the alloy of copper and tin that took a keen hard edge and gave its name to an age. bronze made better tools and deadlier weapons, and because tin was rare and found far away, the hunt for it drove the trade networks outward across the whole region, binding distant lands together in the search for the metal of the age. And consider, finally, the more abstract technologies, the inventions of the mind, that the temple accountants and scholars of Sumer set in motion, and that shape our lives to this hour. They developed mathematics far beyond simple counting, and they did it in a number system based not on 10 but on 60, the sexagesimal system, chosen perhaps because 60 divides so cleanly into so many parts. That ancient Sumerian 60 is still ticking on every clock and watch in the world. The 60 seconds in a minute, the 60 minutes in an hour, the 360 degrees of the circle are a direct inheritance from the mathematicians of the first cities, a piece of Sumer embedded so deeply in our daily life that we never notice it is there. They watched the skies and recorded the movements of the sun and moon and planets with growing precision, laying the foundations of astronomy, developing calendars to govern the agricultural and religious year. They wrote down laws. They kept records. In the first cities, humanity did not only learn to build and to farm on a new scale. It learned to calculate, to measure, to observe, to reason systematically about the world. And it wrote it all down, so that the knowledge accumulated instead of dying with each generation, and could be built upon by those who came after. This is perhaps the deepest gift of the first cities. Not any single invention, but the machine for making inventions. Consider, too, what specialization itself really meant, because it was as revolutionary as any single tool. In the forager band, everyone did more or less everything. Every adult could hunt or gather, make their own tools, build their own shelter, know the whole of their people's practical knowledge. The surplus of the first cities shattered that wholeness and remade it into something new. The specialist, the person who did one thing, all the time, for a lifetime, and did it far better than any generalist could. The full-time potter, throwing pots day after day, grew more skilled than any part-time maker. The full-time metalworker mastered the difficult art of the furnace and the mold. The full-time scribe, the full-time weaver, the full-time builder, the full-time priest, each drove their single craft to heights no generalist could reach. And because each specialist depended on all the others, the potter did not grow grain, the farmer did not make pots, and each needed what the other made. The city became a dense web of mutual dependence, a single great organism of interlocking crafts held together by exchange. This is the division of labor, and it is one of the most powerful ideas in human history. That a society grows richer and more capable, not when everyone does everything, but when each person does one thing and they trade the fruits. That the whole becomes far greater than the sum of its parts when the parts specialize and combine. We live at the very far end of that idea today, in a world where almost no one grows their own food or makes their own tools or builds their own house, where each of us does some single narrow thing and depends on millions of unseen others for everything else. It is the water we swim in, so familiar we never notice it. And it began in the first cities, when the surplus first freed some hands from the fields and let them become, for the first time in human history, specialists. This is perhaps the deepest gift of the first cities. Not any single invention, but the machine for making inventions. The concentration of many minds, fed by the surplus, freed by specialization, connected by writing, so that knowledge could pile up like the bricks of a ziggurat, generation on generation, reaching always higher. For its first many centuries, Sumer was not a single state, but a scatter of rival city-states: Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, Kish, and the rest. Each with its own god and king and territory, each fiercely independent, and each perpetually at odds with its neighbors over land and water and glory. They fought, they raided, they made and broke alliances, one city rising to dominate its neighbors for a time and then falling back. No one had ever conceived of anything larger than the city-state, the idea that one ruler might command many cities, many peoples, across a vast territory, as a single realm, had not yet entered the human imagination. And then, around 2334 BC, a man arose who imagined it and made it real, and so became the first emperor in the history of the world. His name was Sargon, and he built the first empire. Sargon's origins are wrapped in legend, and the legend is a telling one. He was said to have been born in secret to a lowly mother. set adrift on the river in a basket sealed with pitch, and found and raised by a humble gardener. A story of the destined child saved from the water that would echo down the ages and attach itself, much later, to Moses and to others. Whatever the truth of his birth, he seems to have risen from common origins, not born to a throne, and to have seized power first in the Semitic-speaking north of Mesopotamia, in a city called Akkad, whose site is still lost, before turning his ambition on the ancient Sumerian cities of the south. One by one he conquered them. Uruk, Lagash, all the proud old city-states, and welded them, for the first time, into a single realm under a single ruler. Then he pushed outward, campaigning far beyond Mesopotamia, into the mountains and along the trade routes, claiming dominion from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. He forged a multi-ethnic empire spanning peoples and languages and vast distances, held together by his armies, his administrators, and the sheer force of a new idea, that the world could be ruled as one. To hold such a thing together, Sargon and his successors had to invent the arts of empire, much as Uruk had earlier invented the arts of the city. They installed loyal governors in the conquered cities, often their own kinsmen or trusted men, to rule in the emperor's name. They built a standing army, professional soldiers loyal to the crown rather than seasonal levies loyal to a city. They standardized and taxed, and built roads and secured the trade routes, and used the writing system to administer their sprawling domain, dispatching orders and receiving reports across hundreds of miles. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, would push the idea even further, declaring himself not merely the servant of the gods but a god himself, a living deity to be worshipped, the first known king to make that claim, and a sign of how far and how fast the concentration of power had run in the few centuries since the first cities rose. The Akkadian Empire that Sargon founded did not last forever. After several generations it weakened and fell, undermined by rebellion, by invasion from the mountains, and quite possibly by a great drought that recent evidence suggests struck the region hard. But the idea did not die with it. Sargon had shown that empire was possible, that many cities and peoples could be ruled as one, and every conqueror who came after. The kings of who restored a Sumerian empire, Hammurabi of Babylon with his famous laws, the terrible Assyrians, the Persians, and in the end Alexander and Rome. Every one of them was walking, whether they knew it or not, in the footsteps of the gardener's son from Akkad, who first dreamed that the world could be one. And Sargon's empire gave the world one more first, a quieter one, but among the most remarkable of all. Sargon appointed his daughter, a woman named Enheduanna, as high priestess of the moon god at the great city of and Enheduanna wrote hymns and poems to the gods in her own voice, signing her name to them. And because she signed them, Enheduanna is the first author in all of human history whose name we know. Before her, writing is anonymous. Accounts, records, inscriptions, with no individual voice claiming them. Enheduanna, priestess and princess of the Akkadian Empire, is the first human being who wrote something and put her name to it, the first identifiable author in the story of literature, and she was a woman, 4,300 years ago. Her hymns survive, passionate and personal, full of her devotion and even of her own troubles when she was for a time driven from her office. And through them, across all those millennia, we hear the first named human voice in literature, speaking to us directly, a real person who lived and wrote and wished to be remembered by name. That, too, the first empire gave us, not only the idea that the world could be ruled as one, but the first author who ever signed her work. We have travelled far into the first cities now, through Eridu and Uruk, through the birth of writing and the raising of the ziggurats, through gods and kings and wheels and the first great empire. It is a great deal to hold, and the mind, like the traveller, needs to sit down a while by the water before going on. So the story pauses again here, on the bank of the Euphrates, in the long gold evening, and simply rests. It is the close of the day on the great river, in the time of the first cities. The sun is going down over the flat land, huge and red in the dusty air, and the Euphrates runs broad and slow and burnished, carrying the last light on its surface like a road of beaten copper. Along the bank, the day's work is ending. The farmers are coming in from the fields, their tools over their shoulders, their long shadows stretching before them across the ground. Down at the water, the last boats of the day are being poled in and tied up, their cargoes of grain and reeds and pots settled for the night. The great flat plain, so harsh and blinding under the noon sun, softens now in the gold and rose of evening into something almost gentle, the mud brick of the houses glowing warm, the green of the irrigated fields deepening, the date palms along the canals standing black and still against the burning sky. And rising over it all, catching the very last and highest light, the great ziggurat of the city lifts its stepped bulk toward the darkening heavens, its summit shrine glowing gold above the gathering shadow of the streets below, where the god looks out over his city as the day dies. In the city, the evening sounds are rising, the ordinary music of the first urban evenings the world ever knew. The lowing of cattle brought in for the night, the knock and murmur of the day's last business in the lanes, the cry of a child, the bark of a dog, a snatch of song from a doorway, the smell of the evening meal on 1,000 hearths, barley bread and beer and fish from the river, drifting up over the rooftops with the thin blue threads of the cooking smoke. In the great temple, the priests are performing the rites of the day's ending, feeding and settling the god for the night. In the workshops, the potters and weavers and metalworkers are banking their fires and laying down their tools. And in the counting houses of the temple, by the light of a small lamp, some scribe is pressing the last figures of the day into a tablet of wet clay. So many measures of grain, received and recorded. The humble, world-changing act that holds the whole vast city together, done quietly in the falling dark, as it was done every evening for 3,000 years. There is a deep peace in that evening scene, in the first cities at rest. A peace made of ordinary human things, of work ending and families gathering and the long day closing down into night, the same things that end our own days, done for the first time behind city walls 5,000 years ago, under the shadow of the ziggurat, beside the slow gold river. The people of Uruk and did not know they were first. They knew only the evening, and the river, and the coming night, and the god on his high tower, and the smell of bread, and the day's work done. Somewhere in the city, a mother is settling her children for the night, in a small mud brick room, much like the rooms where children have been settled for sleep every night for 5,000 years since, telling them, perhaps, one of the old stories. Of Inanna and her descent, of the great flood, of the first kings to whom kingship came down from heaven. The same human act of the bedtime story. Same drawing of the child down gently towards sleep with the old tales that has gone on in every house in every age from that day to this. Somewhere an old man sits in a doorway, watching the light fade, thinking of the years. Somewhere two friends share the last of a jar of beer and talk quietly as the stars come out. These were people, living an evening, at the beginning of the world, and their evening was not so different from yours. The same falling dark, the same first stars, the same winding down of the day's labor into rest, the same small, warm human things that fill the space between the work and the sleep. The people of Uruk and did not know they were first. They knew only the evening, and the river, and the coming night, and the god on his high tower, and the smell of bread, and the day's work done. Rest here a while, in that ancient evening, by the burnished water, before we leave the land between the rivers and follow the story to the other cradles of the world. The sun is nearly down now. The last boat is tied. The ziggurat holds the final light. And along the great slow river, in the first cities humanity ever built, the lamps are being lit, one by one, against the dark. Leave the land between the rivers now and travel west, across the deserts, to another river and another beginning. One that unfolded at nearly the same time as Sumer's, but in a landscape so different that it produced a civilization with an entirely different character and soul. Follow the greatest river in the world, the Nile, as it runs its impossible course northward for thousands of miles through the burning waste of the Sahara, a ribbon of green and life drawn across the deadest desert on earth. Here, on the banks of the Nile, arose the civilization of ancient Egypt, the great rival and contemporary of Sumer as a cradle of the human story, and in the popular imagination, the most iconic of all the ancient worlds. The Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile, and no phrase has ever been more exact. Egypt is, quite simply, the river. Without it, the whole country would be nothing but a lifeless extension of the Sahara. But the Nile was a very different kind of river god from the Tigris and Euphrates, and the difference shaped everything. Where the Mesopotamian rivers were wild, violent, and treacherous, flooding at the wrong time, changing course, threatening ruin. The Nile was, by contrast, a model of benevolence and reliability. Every year, with a regularity that must have seemed almost divine, it rose in a gentle, predictable flood, fed by the distant monsoon rains on the highlands of Africa far to the south, spread across its valley and delta, and laid down a fresh layer of astonishingly fertile black silt before receding to leave the fields perfectly prepared for planting. The Egyptians called their land Kemet, the Black Land, after that life-giving black soil, as opposed to the Deshret, the red land of the sterile desert that pressed in on either side. The flood came in season, gentle and sure, year after year after year. Where the Sumerian lived in constant, anxious struggle with capricious and dangerous waters, the Egyptian lived in a valley of reliable, almost effortless abundance, cradled by a river that could be trusted. And this difference, chaos and struggle in Mesopotamia, order and reliability in Egypt, sank deep into the two civilizations' souls. The Sumerian gods were dangerous and their world precarious. The Egyptian cosmos was fundamentally ordered, stable, and eternal, governed by a divine principle of harmony and rightness they called Ma'at, and the whole aim of Egyptian civilization was to maintain that eternal order against the forces of chaos. The river taught the lesson, and the civilization learned it. The world is, at its heart, stable, cyclical, and everlasting. The geography of the Nile shaped Egypt in another decisive way. The river ran through a narrow valley walled on both sides by desert, a long, thin ribbon of habitable land. And this natural corridor, protected by the deserts on either side and by the sea to the north and the cataracts to the south, made Egypt unusually unified and unusually secure. Where Sumer was a scatter of rival city-states forever at war, Egypt, strung along its single river highway, tended toward unity. And around 3100 BC, just as Uruk was reaching its height and writing was being born in Mesopotamia, the many communities of the Nile Valley were unified, according to Egyptian tradition, by a single king, remembered as Nama or Menes, who joined the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt into one kingdom under one crown. That unification is commemorated on one of the great objects of the ancient world, the Nama palette, a ceremonial slate carved with the image of the king smeeting his enemies and wearing the combined crowns of the two lands. One of the earliest historical documents from Egypt, marking the birth of the unified kingdom that would endure, in one form or another, for 3,000 years. From that beginning flowed the whole immense pageant of pharaonic Egypt. 30 dynasties, the old, middle, and new kingdoms, the pyramids and the temples and the tombs. 3 millennia of one of the most stable and enduring civilizations the world has ever seen. The sheer duration of it is difficult to hold in the mind. Ancient Egypt was not a moment but an age. It lasted, as a recognizable civilization, for something like 3,000 years, from the unification down to the last of the pharaohs. To put that in perspective, the pyramids of Giza were already more ancient to Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, than Cleopatra is to us. More time separated the building of the Great Pyramid from the reign of the last independent Egyptian kings than separates those kings from the modern world. Egypt endured, recognizably itself, through a span so vast that within it whole other civilizations rose and fell. Sumer and Akkad and Babylon and Assyria came and went. The Bronze Age rose and collapsed. Greece and Rome were born, all while Egypt, on its river, went on. It was the great constant of the ancient world, the deep, stable, unimaginably old civilization that all the others looked back upon with awe as the very image of antiquity and permanence, the land where the gods themselves had once reigned, the oldest and most enduring kingdom under the sun. And at its head stood not merely a king, but a god. The king of Egypt, the pharaoh, as he came to be called, was something even the god-touched kings of Sumer never quite were, a living god on earth. Where the Sumerian king ruled as the servant and steward of the gods, the pharaoh was himself divine, the earthly incarnation of the god Horus, the son of the sun god Ra, the living embodiment of the divine order of Ma'at, the essential bridge between the human and the divine on whom the very functioning of the cosmos depended. His role was not merely to govern, but to maintain the eternal order of the universe, to ensure that the sun rose, the Nile flooded, the crops grew, and chaos was held at bay. This was the theology of the most centralized and absolute divine monarchy the early world produced, And its most staggering physical expression came early, in the period we call the Old Kingdom, in the form of the structures that remain, 45 centuries later, the very symbol of Egypt and of the ancient world itself, the pyramids. The pyramids were tombs, but to call them tombs is like calling the ocean a body of water. They were engines of eternity, machines built to launch a dead god-king into the everlasting life of the heavens and to secure, through his successful passage into the divine world, the eternal order of Egypt itself. The idea grew by stages. First, the low bench-shaped tombs called mastabas. Then, under the Third Dynasty king Djoser and his brilliant architect Imhotep, a man so revered for his wisdom that Egypt later worshipped him as a god. The Step Pyramid at Saqqara, essentially a stack of mastabas rising in giant stairs toward the sky, the first great monumental building in stone in the history of the world and the direct conceptual descendant across 2,000 years and many miles of the mud-brick ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the sacred mountain, the stairway to heaven, raised now in eternal stone. And then, within a few generations, under the Fourth Dynasty, Egyptian ambition and skill reached a peak that has never ceased to astonish in the true, smooth-sided pyramids of Giza, and above all, in the Great Pyramid of the pharaoh Khufu. The numbers of the Great Pyramid still stagger the mind. It was built around 2560 BC. It stood originally about 146 meters high, and it remained the tallest structure made by human hands anywhere on Earth for nearly 4,000 years, until the great cathedrals of medieval Europe finally overtopped it. It contains something like 2.33 million blocks of stone, many weighing several tons and some weighing many tons more, quarried, transported, lifted, and set in place with a precision that modern engineers still study with admiration. The vast base level to within a hair across its whole enormous extent, the sides aligned with astonishing accuracy to the cardinal points of the compass, the vru. Whole colossal mass raised, as far as we can tell, with no machines beyond the lever, the ramp, the sledge, and the almost unimaginable organized labor of a whole kingdom. For a long time, people imagined it was built by miserable slaves under the lash, but the evidence now suggests something different and more remarkable. A largely willing workforce of skilled laborers and seasonal workers, well-fed, well-organized, housed in their own settlements, laboring not as slaves but as participants. Some perhaps in a kind of national service, some for wages of bread and beer, all caught up in the greatest collective project their world had ever known, the building of their God-King's stairway to eternity and the guarantee, through it, of the eternal order on which all their lives depended. The Great Pyramid is not just a tomb or a wonder of engineering. It is the Egyptian cosmos made visible, and we know, now, a surprising amount about the people who built it, because their own settlement has been found and dug. The town where the pyramid workers lived, near the base of the plateau, with its bakeries and breweries and storerooms, its barracks and workshops, and the remains of the food they ate. Bread and beer in abundance, and a great deal of meat, cattle and sheep and goats driven in from estates across the country to feed the builders. This was not the diet of wretched slaves. It was the diet of a valued national workforce, fed well by the standards of the age. The workers were organized into named gangs and teams, and in their off hours, with the very human urge to leave a mark, they daubed their team names on the blocks in out-of-the-way places never meant to be seen. Cheerful, boastful crew names, the Friends of Khufu, the Drunkards of Menkaure, graffiti left by the actual hands that built the pyramids, found by archaeologists inside the stone. And their bones tell of the cost as well as the pride. Skeletons showing the wear of heavy labor, healed injuries, the marks of a hard life, but also of medical care, of broken bones set and mended, of workers looked after when they were hurt. They were real people, with names and teams and jokes and injuries, who spent their lives raising a mountain of stone for their God-King, and who were proud enough of it to sign their work where only eternity would see. The Great Pyramid is not just a tomb or a wonder of engineering. It is the Egyptian cosmos made visible, the absolute concentration of a whole society's wealth, labor, and faith into a single stupendous act of eternity building, a mountain of stone raised by a God-King's people to defeat death itself and hold the universe in its proper order forever. Nothing says more clearly what the first civilizations had become. From the hunter-gatherers who buried Göbekli Tepe to the kingdom that raised the Great Pyramid was a journey of only 7,000 years, and it had carried humanity from the wild hilltop shrine to the deliberate reshaping of the earth itself on a scale that would not be matched for millennia. Egypt, like Sumer, gave humanity a system of writing, and it did so at very nearly the same moment. Right around the unification of the kingdom, at the dawn of the dynastic age, some 5,000 years ago. But where the cuneiform of Mesopotamia grew out of the accountant's need to count, and always kept something of that plain, practical, wedge-pressed character, the writing of Egypt was, from the beginning, something more visibly sacred and beautiful. The Egyptians called it, in effect, the words of the gods. And the Greeks, seeing it carved on the temple walls, would later call it hieroglyphic, sacred carving. It is one of the most beautiful writing systems humanity has ever devised. A script made of pictures, of birds and reeds and eyes and hands and seated figures and coiled ropes, rendered with an artistry that makes every inscription a work of art, marching in stately rows across the walls of the tombs and temples, at once a means of writing and a form of sacred decoration. Hieroglyphic writing was intricate and demanding, a system of hundreds of signs, some standing for sounds, some for whole words, some silent markers that sorted meaning. And mastering it was the work of years, the jealously guarded skill of a small, powerful, literate class of scribes. To be a scribe in Egypt was to hold one of the surest paths to status and comfort in the whole kingdom, exempt from the crushing manual labor of the fields and the building sites, valued and secure. Egyptian texts survive in which a father urges his son to study hard and become a scribe, praising the scribe's life above all other trades in the land. For the scribe, he says, is spared the misery that is the lot of everyone else. For everyday purposes, the Egyptians developed quicker, more flowing cursive forms of the script that could be brushed rapidly in ink onto papyrus. The marvelous paper-like writing material they made from the reeds of the Nile marshes, which gave them a light, portable surface to write on that Mesopotamia, with its heavy clay tablets, never had. On papyrus scrolls, the Egyptians wrote everything. Their accounts and letters and contracts, their medical and mathematical texts, their stories and poems and hymns, and above all their vast and intricate literature of death and the afterlife. For the Egyptians were, more than any other people of the ancient world, in love with eternity and consumed by the hope of defeating death, and their writing was bound up, at the deepest level, with that hope. The whole staggering apparatus of Egyptian death, the pyramids and tombs, the mummification that preserved the body against decay, the treasures buried with the dead, the painted scenes of the afterlife, the spells and prayers written on tomb walls and coffins and papyrus scrolls to guide and protect the soul on its perilous journey through the underworld to the judgment of the gods and the hope of eternal life. All of it was an immense, civilization-wide refusal to accept that death was the end. The Egyptians believed that the person who was properly preserved, properly provisioned, properly remembered, and properly equipped with the sacred words could survive death and live forever in the blessed fields of the afterlife. And the sacred words, the writing, were essential to that survival. To speak the name of the dead, to write it, to keep it, was to keep them alive, for the Egyptians believed that a person truly died only when their name was forgotten and spoken no more. So the whole culture became, in a sense, a great machine for remembering, for writing names and deeds into stone and papyrus against the erasing power of time, for cheating oblivion through the magic of the written word. It is a poignant irony that they succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. For we do still speak the names of Khufu and Ramesses and Tutankhamun, thousands of years after their deaths, exactly as they hoped. The writing did keep them alive in human memory, if not in the blessed fields they dreamed of. And it is through that same obsessive, beautiful, eternity-hungry writing that Egypt speaks to us so vividly across the millennia, in its own sacred words, from the walls of its silent tombs. Now travel east, far east of Sumer, beyond the mountains and the plateau of Iran, to the valley of another great river system, the Indus, in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. And here we come to the strangest case of all among the first civilizations. A society as large, as old, as sophisticated, and as populous as Egypt or Sumer. one of the very greatest of the ancient world, and yet one that almost no one, outside of specialists, has ever heard of. It has no famous kings, no legendary battles, no epic like Gilgamesh, no wonder like the pyramids in the popular mind. For most of modern history, no one even knew it had existed at all. It was utterly forgotten, lost so completely that it had to be rediscovered from nothing by archaeologists less than 100 years ago. This is the Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization after the first of its cities to be found, and it is the great forgotten giant of the ancient world. It arose in the 3rd millennium BC, flourishing at its height from around 2600 to 1900 BC, contemporary with the pyramid builders of Egypt and the Sumerian city-states. And in scale it was vast, the largest of all the early civilizations by area, spreading its cities and towns across a territory of perhaps 1 million square kilometers, from the mountains to the sea, an expanse greater than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It supported a population that may have run to 5 million people. And its cities, when archaeologists finally uncovered them in the 1920s, revealed something that overturned every expectation. Not the organic tangle of most ancient cities, but urban planning of a precision and rationality that would not be seen again for thousands of years. The great cities of the Indus, Harappa, and above all the magnificent Mohenjo-Daro, were built to a plan, on a grid, their streets laid out straight and crossing at right angles, oriented to the points of the compass, dividing the city into regular blocks. Think of what that means. While the rest of the ancient world grew its cities like tangled thickets, the people of the Indus laid theirs out like a modern planner in orderly grids of straight streets 5,000 years ago, and the order went far deeper than the street plan. The Indus cities were built of standardized, kiln-fired bricks, made to consistent proportions across the whole vast civilization, from one city to another hundreds of miles away. A uniformity that speaks of some shared system of standards and measures maintained across an enormous territory. They had, most astonishingly of all, water and sanitation systems of a sophistication that has no parallel anywhere in the ancient world and would not be matched until modern times. Most houses had their own bathrooms and wells. Wastewater ran out through brick-lined drains into a covered sewage system that ran beneath the streets of the whole city. A municipal sanitation network 5,000 years old in the first cities of the Indus. At the heart of Mohenjo-Daro stood a great public structure we call the Great Bath, a large, beautifully made, watertight brick pool reached by steps that seems to have served some public ritual of bathing or purification. The first great public waterwork of its kind. This was a civilization obsessed, it seems, with order, cleanliness, water, and regularity, expressed in a standardized, planned, superbly engineered urban world that puts much of the later ancient world to shame. And yet, for all this sophistication, it has kept its secrets more completely than any other first civilization, because we cannot read a word it wrote, and we still do not fully understand how it worked, or who ruled it, or, in the end, what became of it. The Indus civilization is, in the deepest sense, a mystery, the great enigma among the first cities. And its mysteries are worth dwelling on because they show us how much of the ancient past can be lost and how differently civilization could take shape. 3 great puzzles hang over it, and we can solve none of them completely. The first puzzle is the writing. The people of the Indus had a script. We find it on thousands of small carved seals, beautiful little objects, usually showing an animal, a bull or a mysterious unicorn-like beast or an elephant above a short line of signs. There are hundreds of distinct signs, clearly a real system of writing, and we cannot read a single word of it. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs, which the Rosetta Stone unlocked, or cuneiform, which was painstakingly deciphered, the Indus script has resisted every attempt at decipherment for a century. The inscriptions are nearly all very short, just a few signs, as on the seals, which gives code breakers little to work with, and we have no bilingual key, no equivalent of the Rosetta Stone, no certain knowledge even of what language the Indus people spoke, and so this entire civilization is, to us, silent. The Sumerians and Egyptians speak to us in their own words, across the millennia, through their writings. We know their kings' names, their gods, their poems, their laws, their grievances and hopes. The Indus people wrote, and their writing survives, and yet they remain mute. We cannot hear a single thing they wish to say. An entire great civilization, 5 million strong, and we do not know the name of even one of its people, one of its gods, one of its kings. It is a silence more complete than any other in the ancient world. And yet, silent as it is to us, the Indus civilization was anything but isolated in its own time. Its beautiful carved seals have been found far from home, in the cities of Mesopotamia, carried there by trade across the sea and the land, for the merchants of the Indus sailed the Arabian Sea and traded with Sumer and Akkad, who knew them and wrote of them. In the cuneiform records of Mesopotamia, there appears a distant land called Meluha, from which came exotic goods, carnelian and lapis and ivory and rare woods and gold. And Meluha is very probably the Indus civilization, seen from the outside, named by its trading partners even though it could not name itself to us. So we have the strange situation of a civilization we can glimpse only in the mirror of its neighbors. The Indus is silent in its own voice, but the Sumerians, who could write and whom we can read, mention the far land of Meluha and its precious goods. And so we know the Indus reached out across the world, that its ships and caravans carried its wares to the first cities of Mesopotamia, that it was a full and connected member of the ancient world's first great web of long-distance trade. The giant was forgotten, but in its own day it was known from the Indus to the Euphrates, a silent partner in the commerce of the dawn of history. The second puzzle is the power, or the apparent absence of it. In Sumer and Egypt, the hierarchy screams at you from the ruins. The palaces, the royal tombs stuffed with gold, the colossal statues of god-kings, the monuments raised to individual rulers, the vast difference between the house of the great and the hovel of the poor. In the Indus cities, all of this is strangely, hauntingly absent. There are no palaces we can identify, no great royal tombs, no monuments to kings, no giant statues of rulers, no obvious temples even. The houses, while they vary, do not show the staggering extremes of rich and poor found elsewhere. There is no clear evidence of the kind of centralized, personalized, god-king authority that dominated the other first civilizations. And yet this was a society capable of tremendous coordination. The planned cities, the standardized bricks and weights across hundreds of miles, the great public works, which surely required some form of authority and organization. So who ruled the Indus? A priesthood? A merchant oligarchy? Some form of collective governance we can barely imagine? A power so ideologically self-effacing that it left no monuments to itself? We genuinely do not know. The Indus may have been a different kind of civilization altogether, one that achieved urban sophistication and vast scale through some means other than the god-king and his monuments, a possibility that fascinates and eludes us. And strikingly, for such a large and wealthy civilization, there is remarkably little evidence of warfare. Few weapons, few fortifications built for war, few depictions of conquest or violence or armies. It is possible that the Indus was, by the standards of the ancient world, a strikingly peaceful and unmilitary civilization, which would make it stranger and more remarkable still. The third puzzle is the ending. Around 1900 BC, the Indus civilization declined and, over some generations, came apart. The great cities were gradually abandoned, the sophisticated urban order broke down, the writing fell out of use, the standardized system dissolved, and the population dispersed into smaller village settlements. It did not fall to a dramatic conquest, as far as we can tell. The old idea that invading Aryans destroyed it has been largely set aside. The likeliest culprits are environmental and slow, a great shift in the region's climate, a weakening of the monsoon, and above all changes in the rivers themselves. For the Indus system was prone to shifting its courses, and one major river that watered many settlements seems to have dried up or changed its path, pulling the water and the life out from under the cities that depended on it. Deprived of their rivers and their reliable monsoon, the great planned cities could no longer be sustained, and the civilization quietly unraveled, its people drifting away to smaller and simpler lives, its cities left to the sand and the silence, its writing forgotten, its very existence erased so thoroughly from human memory that 4,000 years later no one knew it had ever been. It is the most sobering of all the stories of the first cities, proof that a civilization can be as great as any, and vanish so completely that it leaves not even a legend behind. Only silent mounds and unreadable seals, and the finest ancient plumbing in the world waiting under the earth for someone, one day, to wonder what they were. Travel further east still, across the whole width of Asia, to the valley of another great, silt-laden river, the Huanghe, the Yellow River of northern China, named for the vast load of fine yellow earth it carries down from the highlands and spreads across the plains. And here, in the fertile basin of the Yellow River and its neighbors, civilization was born yet again. Independently, on its own, out of contact with the West, a separate and self-made beginning that would grow into the longest continuously enduring civilization on the face of the earth. China is the great proof that the birth of cities was not a freak event that happened once and spread, but something that welled up again and again on its own, wherever the conditions were right. For the Chinese did not learn civilization from Sumer or Egypt, whom they had never heard of and would not meet for thousands of years. They invented it themselves, from the ground up, in their own way. The pattern, in its broad shape, is one we now recognize, and its very repetition is the point. Along the Yellow River, from deep in the Neolithic, farming communities grew rice in the wetter south and millet in the drier north, settled into villages, made pottery of great beauty, and slowly, over millennia, grew in size and complexity and sophistication. By the 3rd and early 2nd millennium BC, this long development was crossing the threshold into true civilization, into cities, metalworking, social hierarchy, and centralized power. Chinese tradition remembered a first dynasty, the Xia, at the dawn of this age, half legendary and long doubted by modern scholars. And while its historicity is still debated, archaeology has revealed at sites like Erlitou a genuine early Bronze Age urban culture of exactly the right time and place, with large palatial buildings, bronze workshops, and the clear marks of a stratified, centralized society. The physical reality, whatever its name, of China's first civilization. And then, emerging clearly into the light of history around 1600 BC, came the Shang dynasty, the first Chinese dynasty for which we have abundant and undeniable evidence. And with the Shang, Chinese civilization stands fully formed and unmistakably itself. The Shang world had all the marks of the first civilizations we have seen elsewhere, arrived at independently. Great walled cities and ceremonial centers, a powerful king at the head of a stratified society, a priestly and aristocratic elite, monumental construction, a professional warrior class with chariots and bronze weapons, and enormous royal tombs in which the Shang kings were buried with fabulous wealth. And, in a darker echo of the age's absolutism, with human sacrifices, servants and captives sent to accompany the king into death. Above all, the Shang were masters of bronze, and they raised the casting of bronze to a level of artistry never surpassed anywhere in the ancient world. The great Shang ritual bronze vessels, cast in intricate molds with astonishing skill and covered in dense, powerful, mysterious decoration, are among the supreme artistic achievements of humanity, made to hold offerings in the worship of the royal ancestors. For at the heart of Shang religion stood the ancestors, the dead kings and forebears, who lived on in the spirit world with power over the living, and who had to be served and consulted and appeased through offering and ritual. And it was in the service of consulting those ancestral spirits that the Shang produced the thing that matters most for our story, their writing. China's writing, like Sumer's, is bound up with the most practical of purposes. But where the Sumerian scribe was counting barley, the Shang diviner was questioning the future and the dead. The Shang kings governed in close consultation with the spirit world, and to learn its will, they practiced a distinctive form of divination. A question would be put about the harvest, a coming battle, the weather, the king's health, a sacrifice to be offered, the meaning of a dream. The question was inscribed onto a specially prepared piece of bone, the shoulder blade of an ox or the flat undershell of a turtle, and then heat was applied to the bone until it cracked, and the pattern of the cracks was read as the answer of the spirits. And crucially, the question, and often the answer and sometimes the outcome, were written down, carved into the bone itself in the script of the day. These are the famous oracle bones, and tens of thousands of them survive, and they carry the oldest substantial body of Chinese writing we possess. A script already mature, complex, and fully capable, direct ancestor of the Chinese characters still written by well over 1 billion people today. And that direct descent is the astonishing thing, the thing that sets China apart from every other first civilization. The cuneiform of Sumer is dead and was forgotten for 2,000 years until scholars painstakingly deciphered it. The hieroglyphs of Egypt are dead, unreadable for 15 centuries until the Rosetta Stone gave them up. The script of the Indus has never been read at all. But the writing on the Shang oracle bones, 3,500 years old, is not dead and not foreign. It is the direct ancestor of modern Chinese, its characters recognizably continuous with those in use today, so that the line of descent from the diviner's carved question to the words on a Chinese screen this very night is unbroken across 3.5 millennia. This is the great distinguishing fact of Chinese civilization, its astonishing continuity. The other first civilizations rose, flourished, fell, and were in their original forms extinguished, their languages dead, their scripts forgotten, their gods abandoned, their peoples absorbed and transformed beyond recognition, their achievements recovered only by the spade of the archaeologist. China alone did not break. And Chinese civilization, though it arrived at the same broad shape as the others, cities, kings, writing, hierarchy, monuments, bore from the very beginning its own unmistakable character, its own distinctive obsessions and arts that set it apart from the cradles of the West. Where Mesopotamia and Egypt prized gold, China, from deep in its Neolithic past, prized jade above all. The hard, luminous, difficult stone that could not be carved but only slowly ground and polished, and that the Chinese worked into ritual objects of extraordinary beauty and meaning long before the rise of the Shang, investing it with a significance it would hold throughout all of Chinese history. Where the West built chiefly in stone and mud brick, China developed its own distinctive architecture of timber and rammed earth. And the Chinese preoccupation with the ancestors, with the family line reaching back through the generations and forward into the future, with the veneration of the forebears whose spirits watched over and influenced the living. This deep ancestral piety, already central in the Shang oracle bones, would remain a defining thread of Chinese civilization for all the millennia to come, shaping its family, life, its ethics, its very sense of what a person is and owes. From its very first appearance in the light of history, Chinese civilization was recognizably, distinctively itself. Not a copy of anything, not a variation on a Western theme, but a wholly independent creation with its own soul, arrived at separately on the far side of Asia and destined to endure in unbroken continuity longer than any other. China alone did not break. Dynasties rose and fell, invaders came and went, the civilization changed and grew across the millennia, but the thread was never cut. The same writing system, the same deep cultural continuities, the same civilization, running unbroken from the Shang oracle bones to the present day, the oldest living civilization on Earth, the one first city world that never became a ruin to be dug up, because it simply never ended. And out of that unbroken continuity, China developed a political idea that would govern it for 3,000 years, and that expressed, in its own distinctive way, the same fusion of the divine and the royal we have seen everywhere among the first civilizations. The mandate of heaven. The ruler, the son of heaven, governed by the sanction of heaven itself, the supreme cosmic order. But, in a subtle and consequential twist, that mandate was conditional. Heaven granted its favor to a ruler and a dynasty only so long as they governed justly and maintained the proper order. A ruler who became cruel, corrupt, or incompetent could lose the mandate, and its loss would be shown by disaster, rebellion, and defeat, whereupon heaven would transfer its favor to a new and worthier dynasty. This idea gave Chinese history its long rhythm. The rise of a vigorous dynasty granted the mandate, its long flourishing, its slow corruption and decline, its fall amid disaster and revolt, and the rise of a new dynasty claiming the mandate afresh. A cycle that would repeat again and again across the whole vast span of Chinese history. It was a theory of divine kingship, like Egypt's and Sumer's, but with a conscience built into it. The God-sanctioned ruler who failed his people forfeited the very heavens' support. And it, too, ran unbroken from the ancient world down the millennia, one more thread in the astonishing continuity of the oldest living civilization on Earth. And now, for the most astonishing proof of all that civilization, is something that rises out of humanity itself, not a secret passed from one people to another. Cross the widest ocean on Earth. Go to a place that could not, by any possibility, have known of Sumer or Egypt or China. A place separated from all of them by the entire Pacific and by more than 10,000 years of total isolation, ever since the first hunters crossed into the Americas at the end of the Ice Age. Go to the desert coast of Peru in South America and to a river valley called Supe, where the dry Pacific coast meets the foothills of the Andes. And there, rising from the desert, you will find pyramids, great platform mounds raised by human hands, that are among the oldest monumental structures in the Americas, and that are very nearly as old as the pyramids of Egypt. This is Caral, the greatest site of the civilization we call Norte Chico or Caral Supe, and it is the oldest known civilization in all of the Americas, and one of the oldest in the world. Caral flourished around 3000 to 2000 BC, which means its great mounds were being raised at roughly the same time as the pyramids of Egypt, on the far side of the planet, by people who could not conceivably have had the faintest knowledge of each other's existence. Let that sink in. On two different continents, separated by the whole width of the world, and by more than 10,000 years since their populations had any contact, human beings independently arrived at the same monumental idea: to raise great pyramid mounds toward the sky as the centers of their sacred and civic life. At Caral, in the Supe Valley, there rose a complex of large platform mounds and sunken circular plazas, the largest pyramid mound over 150 meters long and some 18 meters high, a planned ceremonial city supporting a substantial population, a genuine, urban, monumental civilization raised in the coastal desert of South America 5,000 years ago. And it did this while lacking things we assume are prerequisites for civilization. The people of Caral apparently had no pottery. They cooked and stored without ceramic vessels. They had no writing that we have found, though they used an intriguing system of knotted cords, the quipu, that their Andean descendants would develop into a sophisticated recording device millennia later. They seem to have been built substantially on the wealth of the sea. The fabulously rich fishing of the cold Pacific current, traded inland for the cotton and crops of the irrigated valleys, a civilization founded as much on fishing nets as on grain. By the old checklist: farming surplus, pottery, writing, metal. Caral should not have been able to become a civilization at all. And yet there stand its pyramids in the desert, 5,000 years old, monuments to the same deep human impulse that raised the ziggurats of Sumer and the pyramids of Giza, arrived at entirely independently, on the far shore of an ocean none of the other first peoples knew was there. And Caral quietly overturns one of our most cherished assumptions about how civilization has to work. We tend to think of writing, pottery, and metalworking as the very definition of a civilized society, the checklist by which we sort the civilized from the primitive. Caral had none of them, and was a civilization anyway. Monumental, urban, organized, sophisticated, supporting thousands of people in a planned ceremonial city with great public architecture. Built by people who made no pots and forged no metal and, as far as we can tell, wrote nothing down. What they had instead of writing was the quipu, the knotted cord. At Caral, archaeologists have found what may be one of the earliest examples of this device, in which information is recorded in the number, position, type, and color of knots tied along hanging strings. The Andean peoples would develop the quipu, across the following millennia, into a recording system of real sophistication, capable of holding the complex accounts and records of the mighty Inca Empire thousands of years later. A way of writing without writing, of remembering in knots what other peoples remembered in signs. Caral reminds us that the paths to civilization were more varied than our neat checklists suggest, that human beings could raise cities and monuments and organize societies by more than one road, and that the absence of the familiar markers does not mean the absence of the thing itself. The people of the Peruvian coast built one of the oldest civilizations on Earth with fishing nets and knotted cords and sun-dried mud brick, and no writing at all, and it was a civilization all the same. Caral, on the coast of Peru, was one American cradle. But civilization stirred independently in a second place in the Americas as well, far to the north, in the hot lowlands of the Gulf Coast of Mexico. And this second American beginning would give rise to the whole great tradition of Mesoamerican civilization, running down through the ages to the Maya and the Aztecs, whom the Spanish would meet thousands of years later at the very end of the story. The people who began it are called the Olmec, and they are often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, for they were the first, and much of what came after grew from what they began. The Olmec flourished on the steamy Gulf Coast from around 1400 BC, somewhat later than the first cities of the Old World and later than Caral, but still entirely on their own, with no possible knowledge of Sumer or Egypt or China across the oceans. And once again, on yet another continent, in yet another isolated cradle, we see the same deep pattern assert itself. The Olmec built great ceremonial centers with monumental earthen mounds and pyramids. They raised a powerful elite that commanded the labor of many. They created sophisticated art of tremendous power, above all the famous colossal heads, enormous boulders of basalt, some weighing many tons, carved into massive portrait heads of their rulers, with individual faces and distinctive helmets, hauled from distant quarries by sheer organized human effort in a feat recalling the moving of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe or the stones of the pyramids. They developed, it seems, the beginnings of writing and of the elaborate calendar systems that would become a Mesoamerican obsession. They played a sacred ball game with deep religious meaning that would echo down through all the Mesoamerican cultures that followed. They worshipped powerful gods, including a feathered serpent and a were-jaguar that would recur in changing forms for the next 3,000 years down to the Aztecs. Everything essential about later Mesoamerican civilization, the pyramids, the calendar, the ball game, the gods, the divine kingship, the monumental art, has its roots in what the Olmec began in the Gulf lowlands, independently, out of their own genius. And so the Americas, which some once imagined as a mere latecomer to the human story, in fact contain not one but two entirely independent births of civilization, Caral in the Andes and the Olmec in Mesoamerica, each arising on its own, out of touch with the Old World and largely with each other, each arriving at the city, the monument, the elite, and the sacred order by its own separate path. When the peoples of the Americas built their pyramids, they were not copying Egypt, which they had never heard of and never would until the ships came. They were doing again, on their own, what human beings do, gathering, building, reaching for the sky, raising the same great shapes out of the same deep human ground. The two American cradles are the final, decisive proof of the thing this whole night has been circling. That civilization is not the invention of any one people, but a potential that sleeps in all of humanity and wakes again and again wherever the conditions are right, on every continent where human beings have gathered in sufficient numbers to build a world. Caral completes the picture and forces us to confront directly the deepest and most wonderful puzzle of the whole story. The thing that, once you truly see it, changes how you understand our species. Civilization was not invented once. It was invented many times, separately, independently, by peoples who had no contact with one another, on different continents, out of touch across oceans and deserts and thousands of years. And each time, in its broad shape, it came out remarkably the same. Consider what these separate cradles, in their isolation, all arrived at on their own. In Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China, in Peru, and later in Mesoamerica. In cradles that in several cases could not possibly have shared the secret. Human beings independently began to farm, to settle in permanent communities, to grow into cities, to organize themselves into stratified societies with rulers and ruled, to concentrate power in kings or priests or elites, to support full-time specialists and craftsmen, to develop long-distance trade, and, most strikingly of all, to raise great monuments toward the sky, the ziggurats of Sumer, the pyramids of Egypt, the platform mounds of Caral, and later the pyramids of Mexico, all of them on separate continents, reaching upward in the same fundamental gesture. Several of them, independently, invented writing. Several, independently, developed calendars, astronomy, mathematics. Several, independently, arrived at kingship, at organized state religion, at monumental architecture, at social hierarchy. The same basic institutions and the same basic monuments emerged, again and again, from the separate hands of peoples who had never met. This is one of the most profound facts about human beings that we possess, and it cries out for explanation. Why, given the freedom to build any kind of society at all, did we keep building the same kind? Why the pyramid, over and over, on continent after continent? Why the king, the temple, the written record, the stratified city, again and again, arrived at separately? There is no single agreed answer, and we will weigh the possibilities honestly before the night is done. But the fact itself points to something deep. It suggests that the shape of civilization is not an accident of one people's history, not a peculiar invention that happened once and spread, but something that rises predictably out of the encounter between human nature and the settled, crowded, surplus-producing life. That when human beings gather in large numbers, feed themselves from stored surplus, and must organize to survive, they tend, by some deep logic of our nature and our circumstances, toward the same solutions. Hierarchy to coordinate the crowd, a ruler to embody the whole, a state religion to bind and justify, monuments to make the invisible order visible and to reach toward the powers above, writing to hold the accounts and the memory. The pyramids of Giza and the pyramids of Caral were raised by peoples who did not know the other existed, and they raised them anyway, both of them, because something in the human situation, once cities form, tends to produce the pyramid. Think about the pyramid in particular, because it is the strangest of the shared shapes and the most telling. Why a pyramid, of all forms? Part of the answer is simply structural. A broad base narrowing to a peak is the natural, stable shape for piling up a very great mass of stone or earth by hand, the form a heap takes when you want it tall and want it to stand. But that is not the whole of it, because the pyramid was never merely a heap. It was always sacred, always a reaching upward, always a mountain made by human hands. And here perhaps is the deeper truth, that human beings, gathered in their first cities on the flat river plains, feeling small beneath the vast sky and the remote heavens where they placed their gods, reached instinctively for the same gesture. To raise up a great height, an artificial mountain, a stairway toward the sky, to close a little of the distance between the earth where they lived and the heavens where the powers dwelt. The ziggurat and the pyramid and the great mound are all, at bottom, the same yearning made physical. The human reach toward the sky, toward the gods, toward the transcendent, expressed in the one universal language of piled-up stone and earth. On separate continents, in separate ages, human beings looked up at the same unreachable heavens and answered them in the same way, by building upward, by raising a mountain of their own, by reaching. The pyramids of Giza and the pyramids of Caral were raised by peoples who did not know the other existed, and they raised them anyway, both of them, because something in the human situation, once cities form, tends to produce the pyramid. In the separate cradles of the first civilizations, we are watching not one story, but many. And their haunting similarity is a kind of mirror, showing us not the peculiarity of any one people, but the deep and common shape of what human beings become when they build a world. We have crossed the whole world tonight, from the hills of Anatolia to the rivers of Mesopotamia, from the Nile to the Indus to the Yellow River to the desert coast of Peru, and stood in all the separate cradles where humanity first built. It is nearly time to ask what it all meant. But first, the story rests once more, in the deep of the night, under the stars that shine over all the first cities alike, wherever on the earth they rose. It is the middle of the night now, over the ancient world. In Sumer, the great ziggurat stands black against the stars, its summit shrine dark, the god asleep. The city at its foot is silent, the lanes empty, the hearths burned down to embers, the whole vast crowd of the first city sunk in sleep. In Egypt, the Nile runs black and silver under the moon, and the great pyramids stand on their plateau, pale and immense and silent, pointing at the stars they were built to reach. On the Indus, the planned streets of Mohenjo-Daro lie empty and orderly under the same night sky, the covered drains running quiet beneath them, the people asleep behind their neat brick walls. By the Yellow River, the Shang city sleeps, the bronze vessels dark in the ancestral shrines. And on the desert coast of Peru, The great mounds of Caral rise from the Black Valley toward a sky ablaze with the unfamiliar stars of the southern hemisphere, the Pacific breathing softly in the dark beyond. All of them, across the whole world, under the same wheeling stars, the first cities of humanity, asleep. And the stars above them are the same stars. The one thing all these scattered first peoples truly shared, though they never knew it. The people of Uruk and the people of Caral, 10,000 miles and an unbridgeable ocean apart, could never meet, never know of one another, never share a single word or idea. But they looked up, on their separate continents, into the same night, at the same moon, at many of the same stars, and they watched them, and wondered at them, and began, separately, in their different tongues, with their different gods, to trace the patterns and mark the seasons and reckon the passage of time by them. The same sky arched over all the first cities, indifferent and eternal as it arches over us tonight. The people who raised the ziggurats and the pyramids and the platform mounds are gone, every one of them, 5,000 years into the dark. Their languages fell silent, their gods were forgotten, their cities became mounds of dust to be dug up by strangers. But the stars they watched are the stars you could walk out and see tonight, scarcely changed in 5,000 years. The same patient lights that shone over the first hearth fires and the first walls and the first written words, over the whole long human labor of building a world. There is a great peace in that thought and a great rest. In the smallness of the watching human life against the vastness and endurance of the sky, and in the strange kinship it gives us with those first builders. We are, all of us, from Uruk to Caral to this very night, small brief creatures who looked up at the same stars and tried to make something that would last. Most of what they made is dust now, but the trying and the sky endure. And you are the latest of them. The newest of all the countless watchers who have looked up from the sleeping cities of the earth into that same wheeling dark. Tonight the stars are out over your own roof, as they were out over Uruk and Caral, the same patient lights, scarcely moved in 5,000 years, shining down now as they shone down then, over the first cities and over you, holding you and them together in the one great night that has always covered the sleeping world. There is nothing to do under those stars but rest. As all the first builders rested, their work laid down, their day ended, their eyes closing under the same sky. Most of what they made is dust now, but the trying and the sky endure. Rest here a while, under the ancient stars, over the sleeping first cities of the world, before we turn at last to what it all has meant. The night is deep. The cities are asleep, all of them, across the whole world. The ziggurat and the pyramid and the great mound stand dark against the stars, and the same patient constellations wheel over all of them, and over you, holding the first cities and the last in the same enormous, silent, indifferent, and somehow comforting dark. We come now to the deepest question of the night, the one we have carried with us from the buried pillars of Göbekli Tepe all the way around the world. Why? Why did it all happen? Why did human beings, after 200,000 years of building nothing, suddenly and in several places at once, cross the threshold into farming, settlement, cities, and civilization? What was the spark? Having stood in all the cradles, we can at last weigh the possible answers. Honestly, as a detective weighs suspects, knowing that the case has never been fully closed. The first and most necessary factor is climate. It is surely no accident that the whole transformation began right at the end of the last ice age, as the world warmed. The timing is too neat to ignore. For 200,000 years, through the long cold and the wild swings of the glacial climate, nothing, and then, just as the ice retreats and the climate settles into the warm, stable, relatively predictable pattern of the last 12,000 years, the geological epoch we call the Holocene. Everything. A warmer, wetter, more stable world expanded the ranges of the wild grains and made their harvest reliable. A predictable climate made the long investment of farming, planting now to reap months later, a sane gamble in a way it never was in the chaotic Ice Age. The end of the Ice Age did not force civilization, but it opened the door, created the stable, generous climatic stage on which the whole drama could unfold. Almost no one doubts that this was a necessary condition, but it cannot be the whole answer, because the warm, stable climate came everywhere, and civilization did not. It arose only in certain places, and only after some further thousands of years, so climate set the stage, but did not, by itself, raise the curtain. The other suspects cluster around what happened on that stage. There is population, slowly rising numbers, perhaps, that pressed people toward more intensive ways of getting food until farming, harder and less pleasant than foraging, as we have seen, became not a choice, but a necessity to feed the growing crowd, a trap that closed slowly and could not be escaped once entered. There is the settling itself, the possibility, glimpsed at Göbekli Tepe, that people began to gather and to build for reasons of religion, ritual, and social display before they farmed, and that farming came as a consequence of the need to feed those gatherings. That the temple, in a sense, came before the field, and civilization was born of the spirit's hungers before the bellies. There is social competition, the drive of ambitious individuals and groups to accumulate, to feast, to give lavishly, to outdo their rivals and gather followers, which in a settled world of storable surplus could build the first concentrations of wealth and power and the hierarchies that flowed from them. And there is the deep logic we glimpsed in the separate cradles, the possibility that, once the first steps were taken, the rest followed almost inevitably by a kind of ratchet. Surplus enabling specialists, specialists enabling organization, organization enabling more surplus, each step making the next possible and the return to the old free wandering life harder, until humanity had built itself, almost without deciding to, all the way up into the city and the state. The honest conclusion is the one this whole night has pointed toward. There is no single cause, and the birth of civilization was not any one thing but the convergence of many. A warming, steadying climate that opened the door, rich, wild resources in a few favored regions that drew people to settle, slowly rising populations that pressed toward intensification, the human hungers for gathering, worship, status, and display that gave people reasons to build and to stay. And then, once the threshold was crossed, the self-reinforcing ratchet of surplus and specialization and organization that carried it all the rest of the way. No one of these did it alone. All of them, together, in a few favored valleys, at the warm dawn of the Holocene, tipped a species that had wandered for 200,000 years over the edge and into history. And the fact that it happened separately, again and again, on different continents, tells us that the tipping was not a freak but a tendency. That human beings, given a stable world and a rich enough patch of ground, will tend, by the deep logic of their nature, to cross that threshold and build. We do not know every detail of why. We may never fully know. But we can see the shape of it. A door opened by the warming world, and a species that, in several places at once, walked through. And there is a humility worth carrying away from that uncertainty, because it corrects a habit of mind we all fall into. It is tempting to imagine that the birth of civilization was inevitable, a destiny written into our nature, a summit we were always climbing toward, and to look back on the foragers as merely waiting, unknowingly, for the great awakening to come. But the 200,000 years tell against that comfortable story. For almost the whole of human existence, our ancestors did not build cities, and they were not failing or waiting or incomplete. They were living a full and successful human life, one that lasted, in its essentials, 1,000 times longer than the age of cities has yet lasted. Civilization was not the goal that all those millennia were straining toward. It was a late, particular, contingent thing that happened in certain places under certain conditions and might in a different world. A world where the Ice Age had not ended when it did, or where the wild grains had not grown where they grew, not have happened at all, or happened utterly differently. We are not the destiny of our species. We are one branch it happened to grow, late, in a warm and fortunate season. There is something clarifying in holding that thought, in seeing our whole world of cities and writing and states not as the inevitable crown of human history, but as a remarkable, improbable, and precious thing that grew from a particular convergence that need not have occurred. It makes the first cities not less wondrous, but more, not the fulfillment of a destiny, but a genuine creation, brought into being by real people under real skies that might never have been at all. Stand back now from the whole immense story and ask what the crossing of that threshold gave us, because the reckoning runs in two directions, and both must be told honestly. First, the gain. And the gain was, quite simply, nearly everything we now are. Almost the entire world we live in was born in those first cities, and we have never left them. Look around at your own life and trace it back. The writing on every page and every screen. Born in the temple accounts of Uruk. The city you may live in. The very idea of thousands of strangers dwelling together under common rule. Born at Uruk and Mohenjo-Daro. The state, the government, the law, the very notion that a society can be organized and administered from a center. Born in Sumer and Egypt. The wheel that carries you. The plough that feeds you. The mathematics you were taught. The 60 minutes in your hour and the 360 degrees of your circle. Inheritances from the first cities. Organized religion with its temples and priesthoods, monumental architecture, astronomy and the calendar, metallurgy and long-distance trade, specialized professions, and the whole division of labor that lets one person spend a life as a doctor or a builder or a maker of songs while others grow the food. All of it, the entire scaffolding of complex human life, was first erected in those handful of river valleys 5,000 years ago. When we admire the achievements of later ages, Greek philosophy, Roman law, the cathedrals, the sciences, the modern world, we are admiring the upper stories of a building whose foundations were laid by the Sumerians and the Egyptians and the peoples of the Indus and the Yellow River and the Soup. They invented the terms of civilized existence, and every civilization since, including our own, has been an elaboration of what they began. We are, all of us, still living in the world the first cities made. The surplus that fed the first specialist, the writing that held the first account, the wall that enclosed the first crowd. These were the seeds, and we are the vast forest that grew from them. That is what was gained, the whole human world as we know it. It is not a small thing. It is, very nearly, everything. And perhaps the single most powerful thing the first cities gave us, underneath all the particular inventions, was a new relationship with time itself, the ability to accumulate. Before writing in cities, each generation had to relearn the world almost from scratch, carrying forward only what could be held in living memory and passed by word of mouth, so that knowledge could grow only slowly and could easily be lost, a hard-won discovery dying with the person who made it. The first cities changed that, permanently. With writing to fix knowledge outside the fragile mind, with cities to concentrate many minds together, with specialists free to devote whole lives to a single craft or study, with surplus to feed the ones who thought and observed and recorded. Knowledge could now accumulate, pile up, build on itself across generations, each age standing on the shoulders of the last instead of starting over. A discovery made in one lifetime could be written down and passed to the next, and added to, and refined, and never lost. This is the deep engine of everything that followed, of all the sciences and technologies and arts that have transformed human life across the 5,000 years since. And it was switched on in the first cities, when humanity learned to remember across the generations and to build knowledge into a rising tower instead of scattering it to the wind with each death. We are still riding the momentum of that change. Everything we know, every science and skill and art our civilization possesses, is the accumulated inheritance of 200 generations of builders who could, for the first time, pass their discoveries forward instead of losing them. A great rising sum that began in the counting houses and workshops of the first cities and has been growing with gathering speed ever since. But there was a cost, and honesty. The honesty that has been our compass all night requires that we count it too, without either flinching from it or wallowing in it. The birth of civilization was not a simple triumph, a straight ascent from darkness into light. It was a bargain, and a bargain has two sides, and the people who paid the price were, as they so often are, the many at the bottom rather than the few at the top. We have already seen the bodily cost written in the bones. The early farmers, and the mass of the poor in the first cities, were often less healthy, less well-nourished, shorter-lived, and more disease-ridden than the free-ranging foragers who came before. The rich and varied foragers' diet gave way to a monotonous dependence on a few staple grains. The mobile, dispersed life gave way to crowded settlements where filth accumulated and epidemic disease, leaping from the domestic animals and spreading through the packed population, found its first great opportunity. Famine, too, was a child of civilization, The forager, drawing on many wild foods across a wide territory, was cushioned against the failure of any one. The farmer, dependent on a single harvest of a single crop, faced starvation when it failed. But the deepest cost was not to the body. It was to human freedom and equality. We saw, at Sattelhoek, that human beings first gathered in the thousands while remaining roughly equal, without kings or steep hierarchy. That did not last. The stored surplus of the farming world created, for the first time, wealth that could be hoarded, land that could be owned, power that could be concentrated and made hereditary. And out of that grew the steep pyramid of civilized society. The god-king at the summit in his palace, and his tomb of gold, and beneath him the nobles and priests, and beneath them the artisans and merchants, and at the broad base the great mass of peasants and labourers whose toil fed the whole structure, and beneath even them, in most of the first civilizations, the enslaved. For slavery, too, was born here, the owning of human beings as property, an institution. The first cities invented and bequeathed to nearly all of history that followed. The freedom and rough equality of the wandering band, that ancient human birthright of 200,000 years, was traded away, in the crossing into civilization, for the surplus and the city and the state. Most human beings who have ever lived since have lived as the subjects of some ruler, the labourers at the base of some pyramid, in a degree of inequality and unfreedom that their forager ancestors would have found astonishing. This is the shadow side of the great gain, and it is only just to name it. Civilization gave us everything we are, and it did so by building, for the first time, the throne, the tax, the wall, the master, and the slave. The bargain was real, and it was steep, and we are still, in our own age, arguing over its terms. And yet, for honesty cuts both ways. We should not romanticize what was lost any more than we should ignore it. The forager's world had its freedoms and its rough equality, but it was also a world of high infant mortality, of death by violence and accident, and the failure of the hunt, of lives lived at the mercy of a nature that could not be argued with, of small groups that could be wiped out by a bad season or a feud or a wandering sickness. And the surplus and organization that civilization brought, for all the inequality they also brought, made possible things of immense and undeniable worth. Not only the tombs of god-kings, but the healing of the sick. Not only the tax, but the granary that could feed a city through a failed harvest. Not only the slave, but the scholar, the artist, the physician, the whole flowering of human thought, and beauty and knowledge that only the surplus could support. The bargain was not simply a fall from grace, a paradise traded for a prison. It was a genuine and agonizing trade. Freedom and equality and health on one side, and knowledge and art and security and sheer human possibility on the other, with no clean answer as to which weighed more. Most of us, given the honest choice, would probably not trade our world of medicine and books and cities for the forager's freedom, whatever we lost in the exchange. And most of us, if we are honest, are glad the bargain was struck, even as we mourn its cost. That is the truest thing to say about it. It was a real bargain, with real gains and real losses, and we are its heirs on both sides of the ledger, holding the whole inheritance, the glory and the injustice, the knowledge and the inequality, the city and the chains, all together as we have from the very beginning. For all the vastness of this story, the continents, the millennia, the great forces of climate and surplus and power, it is easy to lose sight of the simplest and truest thing about the first civilizations, which is that they were made, every stone and every furrow and every written line of them, by individual human beings exactly like us. Before we close, let us bring the story down from the heights to the human scale, and remember them not as civilizations, but as people, because they were people, as real and as fully alive as you are, listening now in the dark. There was a farmer, somewhere on the Mesopotamian plain, who rose before dawn and walked out to the fields as the light came up gold over the flat land, and worried about the flood and the salt and the tax, and felt the old ache in his back, and loved his children, and grew old, and died, and was forgotten, and was as real as you are. There was a scribe in Uruk, a boy first, learning the hundreds of wedge signs by copying them over and over on practice tablets, scolded by his teacher for his clumsy strokes, And then a man, bent over his clay in the temple counting house by lamplight, tired at the end of a long day of tallying grain, proud of his difficult and valued skill. And he was as real as you are, and because of him we can hear his world at all. There was an Egyptian woman who ground the grain and baked the bread and raised the children and mourned at the funerals and rejoiced at the festivals, whose name is utterly lost, who was as real as you are. There was a child in Mohenjo-Daro who played in a planned street of that orderly city 5,000 years ago and washed in water that ran from a well through the finest plumbing in the ancient world, and never knew that her whole great civilization would one day be forgotten so completely that no one would even know its name. And she was as real as you are. There was a diviner in the Shang court, laying the hot bronze to the oracle bone and watching for the crack, carving the question to the ancestors in signs that 1 billion people would still, in altered form, be writing 3,500 years later. There was a fisherman on the coast of Peru, hauling his nets from the cold, rich sea in the shadow of the great mounds of Coral, who never dreamed there were other pyramids on the far side of a world he did not know was round. They were us. That is the thing to hold on to. Not primitive, not simple, not lesser. Us, the same creature, with the same brain and the same heart and the same loves and fears and hopes, set down in a different and more difficult world, and building, out of mud and reed and stone and sheer human will, the very foundations we still stand on. When you read the name of a Sumerian king or marvel at a pyramid, remember the ordinary millions behind them. The farmers and scribes and mothers and children and fishermen and slaves, each one a whole world of experience as real and as vivid as your own, who lived their single, irreplaceable lives in the first cities of the world, and whose collective labor across 100 generations built the stage on which all of later history, including this very night, including you, would play out. They are gone, all of them, into the deep dark of 5,000 years. But they were here. They were real. And they were us. And here is the strangest and gentlest thought of all, the one to carry down towards sleep. Every one of those countless people, across all the first cities of the world, laid themselves down at the end of each day, exactly as you are lying down now, and let the day's work and the day's worries go, and closed their eyes in the dark and slept. The farmer on the Mesopotamian plain, the scribe in Uruk, the Egyptian mother, the child in Mohenjo-Daro, the diviner in the Shang court, the fisherman by the mounds of Coral. Every one of them knew this same nightly surrender, this same letting go of the day into sleep, this same sinking down into the dark that you are moving toward right now. Across 5,000 years and all the continents of the world, in every one of the first cities, human beings ended their days as you are ending yours, by lying down and letting go and sleeping. It is the one thing that binds you to them more surely than any monument or invention. The simple human night, the daily descent into rest, shared unbroken from the first cities to this one, from their evenings to yours. They are gone, all of them, into the deep dark of 5,000 years. But they were here. They were real. And they were us. And they slept, as you are about to sleep, under the same stars, at the end of the same kind of day. There is one last thing to see before we let the night close over the first cities, and it is perhaps the most wonderful of all, the thread that runs unbroken from them to you, from the first mud brick to this very moment, connecting the buried pillars of Göbekli Tepe to the device on which you are, not quite watching, drifting towards sleep. Nothing that the first cities built has ever really stopped. The line has never been cut. The writing invented in Uruk to count barley became the writing that recorded the laws of Hammurabi and the epics of Babylon, and then, passing from people to people, transforming as it went, the alphabets of the Phoenicians and the Greeks and the Romans, and so the letters on this screen. The mathematics of the Sumerian scribes, their base of 60, still divides your every hour and marks every angle you measure. The cities they first imagined grew, across 5,000 years, into every city that has ever stood, including the one you may be sleeping in tonight. The state they invented to manage the crowd and the canal is the direct ancestor of every government on Earth. The very idea that human beings live in organized societies, under written law, in permanent settlements, fed by specialized labor, keeping records, worshipping in built temples, ruled from centers. The entire template of civilized human existence was drawn up in those first river valleys, and we have been living inside it, elaborating it, ever since. When you woke this morning in a house, in a city, under a government, and read something written down, and knew the time by a clock divided into 60, and ate bread made from domesticated grain, and went about a specialized job that fed you without your growing a single stalk of wheat, you were living, in every detail, the life the first cities invented. The very wheat in your bread is descended, seed by seed across 10,000 years, from the wild grasses those first Anatolian farmers began to tend on their hillsides. The very letters you read are the great-great-grandchildren, transformed through 100 generations of hands, of the wedge marks a Sumerian pressed into clay to count his barley. The very hours of your day are cut into 60 parts because Sumerian mathematicians reckoned in 60s 5,000 years ago. You are not merely descended from the first cities in some vague and general way. You are living, in the most literal and specific detail, in your bread and your letters and your clock and your city and your laws, inside the world they made, using the very tools they invented, eating the very plants they tamed, speaking, in a sense, the words they first learned to write down. When you woke this morning in a house, in a city, under a government, and read something written down, and knew the time by a clock divided into 60, and ate bread made from domesticated grain, and went about a specialized job that fed you without your growing a single stalk of wheat, you were living, in every detail, the life the first cities invented. They are not a closed chapter, a dead and distant past. They are the foundation of the house we still live in. The thread runs from their hands to yours, unbroken across 5,000 years, and you are holding the far end of it right now. And that is the deepest reason to remember them, and to have made this long journey through the night to stand in their first streets. Not out of mere curiosity about the dead, but out of recognition. The recognition that they are our beginning, that we are the continuation of what they started, that the story of the first civilizations is not someone else's story, but the first chapter of our own. When those hunter-gatherers raised the first pillar at Göbekli Tepe, when that scribe pressed the first account into the clay at Uruk, when the people of Corral heaped up the first great mound by the Pacific, they did not know they were beginning us. But they were. The whole long human adventure that runs from their fires to ours, from their first walls to our vast cities, from their first written marks to all the libraries of the world. It is one continuous story, and they wrote its opening lines, and we are still writing it now, and someday, far down the unbroken thread, others will look back on us as we look back on them, as the ancients, as the beginners, as the ones who, in their time, built the world a little further toward whatever it is becoming. The thread is unbroken. It runs through you. And on that thought, the first cities can let us go, down at last towards sleep. And now our long journey through the beginning of the world draws to its close, and it is time to let it all go, and let yourself sink down towards sleep. There is nothing left to do now but rest. The work of the first day is over, as the work of every day since has ended, and the great quiet is coming. Let the whole vast story settle over you now, softly, like dust settling over a buried temple, like silt settling on the floor of a slow gold river. Let it go. The hills of Anatolia and the buried stones of Göbekli Tepe, the painted rooms of Çatalhöyük with the ancestors sleeping beneath the floor. Let it go. The land between the rivers, the first cities rising from the mud, Uruk with its towering temples, the scribe in the lamplight pressing the day's last figures into the clay. Let it drift away. The great ziggurat catching the last gold light, the pyramids standing pale and eternal above the Nile, the orderly silent streets of Mohenjo-Daro, the oracle bones of the Yellow River, the great mounds of Caral rising from the desert toward the southern stars. Let all of it grow soft and dim and distant now, the way the first cities themselves grew dim and were buried and slept for thousands of years under the patient earth. You do not need to hold any of it. Let it settle and fade and sink down into the deep quiet where all the ages go. Feel how far we have come tonight, and how far it all is from you now, and how safe you are, here, at the far unbroken end of that long, long thread. 5,000 years of nights have passed since the lamps were lit in the first cities, all those countless people who built the beginning of the world, the farmers and the scribes and the kings and the mothers and the children, Every one of them has long since lain down, as you are lying down now, and let the day go, and closed their eyes, and slept. The great ziggurats have crumbled back into the earth they were made from. The pyramids stand silent under the stars. The cities are dust and mounds and silence, sleeping under the sand of 5,000 years. And it is all well. It is all as it should be. Everything they built passed in its time into the quiet, and was not lost, but only laid down, like a child laid down to sleep, to wait in the patient dark. There is no weight you need to carry out of this night, no fact to keep, no thread to hold. The whole long story has been told, and now it can be set down, the way the builders of Göbekli Tepe set down their great stones and covered them over and walked away, the way the scribe set down his tablet at the end of the day, the way every one of those countless people set down the day's labor each night and let themselves sink into sleep. You have walked through the whole beginning of the world tonight, from the first buried temple to the last, and now the journey is over, and there is nothing left to do but rest. Everything they built passed in its time into the quiet, and was not lost, but only laid down, like a child laid down to sleep, to wait in the patient dark. Rest now, traveller. Let your body grow heavy and warm. Let the whole weight of the day, and the whole weight of those 5,000 years, settle and release. There is nothing to do now, nothing to hold, nothing to finish. The first light that rose over the first fields has long since set. The stars wheel over the sleeping cities of the world, the first and the last alike. And you can let go now and follow them all down into the dark, into the deep and gentle quiet where the whole world rests at the end of the day. Sleep now. The first cities are asleep and have been for 5,000 years under the kind and patient earth. The story is told. The lamps are out. The long day of the world is done, and the night has come, soft and complete, over all the ages of humanity, over the first fires and the last, over everyone who ever built or dreamed or rested, over you. Let it carry you down, gently, into sleep. Sleep well, traveller. Good night.